Ladies and gentlemen, oops. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Neurostarcraft, and welcome to another episode of Role Discussion with Agent Smith. We're going to talk about the world, see what's going on, talk about history, talk about economics and politics and shit like that. This is a conversation where neither person is a complete expert on these kind of topics, so if you have any feedback for us or if you have any questions, feel free to engage, as this is a open and community conversation. I will jump into chat here with Mr. Agent Smith. Agent Smith. I'm not pushed to talk. Agent Smith.
Hello?
Agent Smith.
Hey, how are you?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
I'm running on 3 hours of sleep, so I'm a little burned out, but other than that, I'm doing okay.
3 hours is not a lot.
That's what Stellaris does to a man.
Ah. We have the gaming reason. At least it's a fun reason. Better than being woken up by chronic pain or something. Agent Smith willed himself up to stay late.
Gotta build those space empires, yo.
Yep, I hear that. So, just to give an update, I have been hearing from Bitter Sugar, so he is still alive and well. As well as one could be. I did also hear about his mom. Did I mention her last week?
You did not. What's up?
Okay, his mom is in eastern Ukraine in an area that is currently occupied by Russian military.
Oh, no shit.
She is okay, and he calls her for about a minute a day because she has to manage her electricity amount just to see that she's all right and everything. And she's an older lady with 2 dogs, and they advised her to leave the country. And she said something to the effect of, "I've lived here my whole life, you can't make me leave." Which is very badass. So respect to Bitter Sugar's mom.
Yep.
Who was telling them, fuck off, this is my house. Great.
Yeah, it's hard to leave when you have roots. A lot of people have kind of faced that conundrum. So more power to her for sticking it out, but kind of wished she'd left. It's still quite dangerous.
Yep.
Well, hopefully she'll be okay.
I've seen that sentiment from a lot of people in like documentaries and stuff that I watched. I watched one that was just a person going through Kyiv and interviewing people, and a lot of this stuff in the city is happening kind of as normal. Like, some people chose to stay and they still go about their business. The streets are pretty much deserted compared to what Kyiv would look like in non-war time, where there's a traffic jam constantly downtown. But there's a pretty decent morale for people overall. Obviously it's war, so there's a lot of very ugly stuff that's happening regularly, but many people just chose to stay, and they're asked them, like, why are you still here? Well, this is the city I've lived in my whole life, and I love this place, and you can't make me.
Yeah, they're sticking it out. The protesters in particular are impressive. There's not a whole lot stopping the Russian army from just laying into them.
You're talking about protesters in Russia?
In Ukraine. In occupied Ukraine, I should say. Yeah, there's been rolling protests in a number of cities. And those are just the ones that we have video footage of.
Oh, they're protesting in the cities that have been taken?
Yeah.
Ah.
And the Russians don't quite know what to do with them, it seems. They generally let them go. Sometimes they'll fire into the air to try to disperse them. And I think they've sent in the Rosgvardia, which is like a kind of pseudo-national guard unit in Russia that they use for mass protests. And so they sent them in with the army when they invaded. Actually, one of the things I read is that they sent the basically they're glorified riot police, and they sent them in with the army in the first wave when the war first started, and so they were among those that really just got slaughtered in that first week or so.
Mm-hmm.
Just more evidence of bad planning. You don't really start a war with your riot police, but Russia did. But there's some survivors anyway, and so they've been spotted in occupied cities and towns and whatnot.
Does that tie in with the misconception that they were going to be liberators and people are going to be mostly keen for it?
Yeah, well, it ties in with the fact that they weren't expecting resistance. Like they were principally focused on rolling in and then administration.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, there's probably going to be at least a little pushback. So, you send in riot police just to establish order and whatnot. Hasn't been working,
Mm-hmm.
but that hasn't stopped them from trying. Yeah, I was watching a video online the other day of what protests in, I think it was Kherson being dispersed with tear gas, I think it was. Although the headline suggested they were shooting into the crowd, but it was a little hard to tell because the footage was kind of from far away. It's possible. You know, the war's kind of been entering an uglier phase that may become more normal. You know, the first month or so was pretty much conventional warfare, but things did not go according to plan, obviously, for Russia. And so now it looks like they're shifting gears and, kind of like what we talked about last week. Their strategy now is pretty much to just try to hold on what they've taken
Mm-hmm.
while trying to take over what of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts that they haven't already taken. So the thinking is they're going to take Donetsk and Luhansk and then just sit on their current holdings and then try to negotiate the status of those occupied regions from a position of strength, quote unquote strength. It'll be relatively hard for the Ukrainians to take territory rather than defend territory, so the Russians will have relatively more leverage there.
Mm-hmm.
So the thinking goes. Maybe the Ukrainians surprise everybody. They've actually been making more ground lately, but it would seem that we're going to enter a phase where there's more of a stalemate, where there's less mobility in terms of how the front lines change. And so, given that's the case, we may see fighting shift a little more towards insurgency, because the occupied areas are obviously not thrilled at being occupied.
Mm-hmm.
And so, since the Russians are just going to try to sit on them, we may see more repression, specifically more violent repression of protests, so that the protesters don't undermine the Russian negotiating position by pushing them out of cities or otherwise undermining the Russian notion that these are areas that they have solid control over. Yeah, there's well, did you hear the big news the past week?
I heard that there was I don't know if this is it, it's a guess, that they hit a gas depot or something in Russia. So that was
Yeah.
maybe one of the first
That's not what I
times.
had in mind, but yeah, actually that was pretty wild.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
it was
people expected Ukraine to be purely defensive.
well, mostly they have been. They haven't had a lot of opportunity, to kind of take the war into Russia, but there've been it's happened a couple of times. This recent raid was not the first. There was a previous incident in which they fired a tactical ballistic missile called the Tachka U. They fired one of those at a Russian airfield in Rostov in southwestern Russia and did a little damage there. And there was one other one. Oh, let me see. Maybe I have it here in my notes. Yeah, there was a drone attack on a fuel train in northern Crimea, in so much as you want to consider Crimea Russian anyway. So two incidents there, but the most recent one on Belgorod was the most bold. It involved two Ukrainian helicopters that were, I believe, Mi-24s. Those are the Hind attack helicopters that are so famous. Well, I mean, if you're a military nerd, they're famous anyway. Uh, so what they sent in two, and basically they just rocketed the shit out of this oil depot and blew it the fuck up, set it on fire, and then left. And it's not entirely clear how they pulled it off. I guess it could have been like a special forces raid or something, or well, the air equivalent of special forces anyway. But we did have some of it on video. There is actually footage of it from security cams at the site that was attacked. And you can pretty clearly see like two attack helicopters rocketing the target there. So the Russians were saying it was the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainian government actually denied involvement. And they said that it might have been a Russian false flag. I don't think that's really true. I don't know what the Russians would get out of that. So I think the Ukrainians are just being a little cagey here. But yeah, I mean, assuming it was in fact the Ukrainians, as everybody is assuming, then it was a pretty bold-faced raid there, attacking Russian logistics, which of course has been their principal strategy through the war thus far. Trying to undermine the Russian ability to provide fuel, ammunition, food, and other critical supplies to their frontline units. So certainly, Belgorod is one of the main jumping-off points for Russian units into Ukraine. So attacking the oil depot there is a pretty smart move. They could have just moved some helicopters right up next to the border and refueled at some kind of forward operating base and then jumped over. That's kind of my best guess as to what happened. We were talking last week about that like one little stretch of border between Ukraine and Russia where there hasn't really been any action and no territory has really changed hands. So that actually might have been where they jumped off from. That could have been where the helicopters launched the raid from. Hypothetically, that would have been within range. Yeah, one of the big criticisms was how the Russians weren't able to detect the helicopters. Russia is always bragging about their surface-to-air missile systems, so it seems there's a little bit of trouble there. At this point, that probably wouldn't surprise anybody, given how the rest of the Russian military has performed. But still, this is just another indication that there are deeper issues in the Russian military as an institution. But yeah, that was a fun one. Nice to see them hitting back for once.
Mm-hmm. We did have a couple kind of pre-questions from chat wanting an update on Finland.
I sent you a thing on Discord because I actually heard you talking about that before we started.
Mm-hmm.
So I sent you a Twitter thread on Discord, a link to a Twitter thread on Discord that is exclusively about that. I haven't finished reading it yet, so I'm not entirely confident talking about the topic, but that's definitely what I would refer people to. But from what I do know about it, Finland is probably going to make a bid to join NATO. There is majority support amongst voters. Pretty much all of the political parties are on board. I was reading in that Twitter thread, actually, that the only nominal opposition is amongst left and center-left parties. There's about 3 of them, I think. But even there, most of their voters actually support it, so they'll probably be on board, too. So it's going to take time. They're kind of going through a sort of defense review right now. So they're probably going to have a big parliamentary discussion about, strategy and defense and foreign relations and whatnot. And it'll play out over the course of the next couple months. So what I was reading is that Finland will probably discuss joining NATO, will probably decide to join NATO, and then will formally vote to submit an application probably by sometime late this year. And I think everybody is pretty much okay with Finland joining. Normally there's kind of a long process by which countries have to prove that they meet certain standards of democratic and liberal governance, and in which they're dealing with corruption, and in which their military meets certain parameters. But Finland almost certainly meets all of those. I would be shocked if they didn't. Finnish democracy, Finnish governance, and Finnish military are generally relatively well respected.
Right. The reason that they haven't been in NATO so far isn't because they didn't qualify, it's because they didn't try to get in.
Exactly. So, if they did apply, they would almost certainly get in.
Mm-hmm.
That's my understanding right now. So Finnish membership, once the application is submitted later this year, will probably happen sometime, I would assume, next year. Mm-hmm. Hypothetically, they could force them to go through like the nominal transition phase, which is normal, but I imagine they'll probably get some kind of waiver, since it's, kind of pointless in this case. Everybody knows they qualify. So it'll probably be an expedited process. all the more so because there's going to be concern about what Russia will do in retaliation.
Mm-hmm.
The Russian government pretends anyway to care about having NATO on its borders. And so nominally, at least, they'll have to do something in retaliation. So if only for that reason, they'll probably expedite membership just to ensure that that security umbrella covers them as soon as possible. I don't know that Russia's too much of a threat at this point, since most of their military, if not almost all of it at this point, is kind of stuck in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
So it's probably not going to be too much of a threat for the foreseeable future anyway. Also, some of their best units have taken heavy losses, so that's also going to inhibit their capacity to act considerably for a while. But no need to take chances. I mean, the Russian government has proven that it's not the most rational at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So why risk it? Yeah, so they'll probably expedite the process, and I would guess they'll be in by at least the end of next year. Let's see. Well, yeah, that's Belgorod was like one big news item, but the other one is that the Russians have withdrawn from northern Ukraine. Did you hear about that?
I've heard that the area around Kyiv was opened up. Is that what that's referring to?
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, the Russians said that they would withdraw some units, supposedly because they wanted to establish good faith in the peace talks. Everybody kind of assumes, though, that they're just taking the opportunity to redistribute troops into eastern Ukraine
Mm-hmm.
so they can focus on taking the rest of Donetsk and Luhansk. But anyway, the withdrawal was pretty slow in the first day or two, so people were kind of skeptical it was happening at all. But eventually there were more and more signs, and now the Ukrainian army has been shown to be in most of those areas that the Russian army had been occupying. And on the Ukraine war live map, they show that whole area northwest of Kyiv as having been cleared all the way to the border. So that seems then to suggest that the Battle of Kyiv is over and that the Ukrainians have won, much to their credit.
Hmm.
Yeah, the Ukrainians have also been either pushing or taking territory that the Russians withdraw in the area east of Kyiv. And so that suggests that significant territory is being retaken. Let me see. I haven't seen it in like a day, so maybe there's something new to look at. If I can find it. Now it's lost in the clutter. Well, anyway. Yeah, that area around Kyiv seems to have been secured by the Ukrainian army. So that's a big win for them. We'll see if it really means anything in the long run, because again, the Russians are probably just resting and refitting some units and redeploying others to other areas. So the fighting is hardly over, but definitely a win here at this stage in the conflict. So yeah, that was pretty big news for them.
Yeah, Ukraine definitely having a lot more grit and teeth than the world expected. Whoever thought it was a good idea to mess with them, they were sorely mistaken, it seems like.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. Oh wow, they've gotten even more land by now. Oh wow, Konotop. Yeah, I'm looking at the live map, so in the past 24 to 48 hours, it seems they've pushed even further east. That is to say, east of Kyiv. So there was a town called Konotop that had been surrounded by the Russians and bypassed in the first couple days of the war, and it had been under siege for pretty much the past month or so. But if this live map is accurate, not only has the siege been lifted, but the Russians have been cleared well to the east of the town. So yeah, that's another win for them. They won the siege of Konotop as well.
I can pull the map up here. So I think I'm looking at Kyiv here. And yeah, it looks like there's not really too much around. There was just a missile strike
Yeah, you see that there was it used to be there was red all the way to the border northwest of Kyiv. And then
Hmm.
there was a huge prong of Russian forces that were approaching eastern Kyiv. You can see there's a town east of Kyiv called Brovary, and the Russians had pushed all the way west to that point.
Hmm.
And then there was also a line of Russians pushing on Chernihiv, way north of Kyiv. So they were all up in that area there, and now all of it is clear. That's a huge chunk of territory that they've withdrawn from now.
Yeah, it has all these markers for Ukrainian clearing the village. So they only really have just this edge here in the northeast. They do have this. I guess this is the chunk that they took first in the invasion. They've kept is this eastern front.
Yeah, even that's kind of been sort of shrinking over time.
Man, they just like missiled the crap out of Mariupol. I've watched some documentaries just going around the city and stuff. It is just a ruin.
Yeah, they got it pretty good.
I don't think they hit Odessa at all.
They've been kind of intermittently bombing it by air and with cruise missiles, but yeah, they haven't been able to get in range in order to use like Grad rocket launchers and artillery.
Yeah, my understanding of how military advance works was pretty informed by this conflict. One thing that I think I had them in separate categories where you could just take air superiority if you had better planes, or you could just take ground superiority if you had better ground stuff. But you really need the whole set to control an area consistently. Because if you have more planes but you have no ground support, then they're just gonna, with much cheaper anti-air, kill your air stuff, and then it's a bad idea for you to send planes in. That would be heavy losses. But then
Mhm.
if your tanks don't have enough infantry support, those also fail. So you really need like a well-rounded and complete, checking all the boxes off for a push. And then you have to be able to occupy it too, which that takes a lot of personnel.
Yeah, that's what they call the combined arms warfare. At
Mm.
least that's what I think it's called. I don't have a military background, so that's my understanding. But yeah, there's well, for example, to kind of underline your point here, one of the debates I've seen online is about tanks. Some people have been really hyperbolic saying tanks are obsolete. We don't need tanks anymore. You can defeat tanks with these, just cheap rocket launchers and anti-tank missiles and stuff. But that's not really entirely accurate. It's true that there's a lot of weapons in the battle space now that can, defeat tanks pretty readily. But in a report that I read about the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict in Karabakh, I guess a couple of years ago now, wow, they were talking about how drones had been really lethal, uh, targeting tanks on the Armenian side. And so they kind of asked the question, is there any point to having tanks now, given that you can just blow them up, with drones, or in this case with, anti-tank missiles? And the answer was they were actually still useful, because pretty much every other ground asset you can have, like infantry, artillery, etc., all of them are just as vulnerable to drones and whatnot. So the advantage then of tanks is that even if they're vulnerable, they're still the most survivable unit on the battlefield, and
Mm.
hence they still have use. Even if they're vulnerable, they're much more difficult to kill, and they force your opponent to use relatively more advanced weapons and whatnot. So the trick to modern warfare is not like to lean heavily on infantry, to avoid casualties from anti-tank missiles or drone strikes and whatnot. The trick is to have a balanced force, like you say. You can have tanks, but you need to make sure that you have to make sure that you secure the air so that they're not as vulnerable from drones and whatnot. You need to have infantry support so you're not as vulnerable to anti-tank missiles. And then if you can do that, then the tanks actually are a big asset because they have a big advantage in terms of firepower and armor over lighter infantry units as well as other armored units. So everything is about balance. And if you can do that, then you can really dominate a battle space. Russia has not done that. Russia has proven not only that they don't really have a lot of the equipment necessary to fight in a modern battle space, but they don't know how to cooperate amongst the different arms of the Russian military. There's been, from what I've read anyway, there's been little evidence of like combat air support, or at least substantive combat air support. There's not a lot of evidence of close cooperation between frontline units and artillery strikes. Artillery is basically being used as a sort of medieval catapult at this point. They're using it to target fortified positions, cities, whatnot, and targeting them en masse, as opposed to using artillery to target positions that are provided to them by frontline units that need support. That's more what modern Western militaries do with artillery. So that's a big disadvantage for them, and a big advantage for the Ukrainians, whom are much better at doing that.
Yeah, and then there's the other factor too of upgrades for your units. So a lot of the tanks that were sent in weren't really the best of what a person could possibly send for a tank force.
That's putting it mildly.
These are very old units. The thing that's crazy to me about military tech is some of the stuff is still pretty good, even if it was made a long time ago. An example would be the F-16 plane. I saw there was an air show of that YouTube video, like over the shoulder. That plane still goes really fast and it still slaps. But obviously, if you're getting something that's more modern than that, it's going to be more effective in a variety of ways.
Well, don't let the sexy fool you, Neuro. There's a lot of work being done under the hood there. The trick to keeping old aircraft useful is upgrading them. So there's almost perpetual what are called block upgrades that are done by the U.S. military on older equipment, specifically aircraft in this case. And they update the engines, they update the avionics, the software and stuff. They update the weapon systems. Just everything is just constantly being, what would you say, renovated, I guess. I'm not even sure what the right term would be.
Mm-hmm.
But because they're constantly updating the aircraft and keeping it up to date, it doesn't really age poorly. It's not quite as cutting edge as like the most modern aircraft, but because they're always updating it, it's still proficient.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, the F-16 is older, but if you look at the sum of its parts, if you look at the individual parts that make up the sum of the parts of the aircraft, those parts are actually relatively new for the most part.
Mm.
So that's how they keep young and sexy.
So it's modular to the extent that you can still have an F-16 frame, but it doesn't have all the guts of a F-16 from the 70s.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's why we still have the B-52 bombers. I don't think we have any B-52 bombers in our fleet that were made after, the 1960s, I want to say.
Mm-hmm.
All of them are pretty much half a century old at this point, which is pretty old for an aircraft. If you look at the dawn of aviation in the early 20th century, 50 years pretty much covers the ground between the first airplane, the first flight by the Whitney brothers, and that goes right up to like the space age. So that's how long the B-52 has been in service, that's a very long time. But the way that they keep them flying is through block upgrades. They upgrade the engines, they upgrade the avionics, etc., and it still works. It can only work so long. You can't do that forever. Sooner or later the planes just get old and you got to basically just rebuild them. And at that point, you might as well just buy a new plane. And so they actually do have a new bomber program to try to develop a replacement. We'll see where that goes. That's not the first time they've tried to replace the B-52. They tried to develop a supersonic bomber, I guess, the B-1 Lancer. And that was very expensive, to put it mildly. That was all the way back in, I want to say the 70s. And then, the big thing then was speed. Before then they'd tried to design aircraft that could fly above surface-to-air missile systems, but it became apparent pretty quickly that Soviet SAM systems were going to be able to pretty much reach any altitude that you could get to. So after that, they started trying to focus on designing planes that could outrun surface-to-air missiles. So that's how you get stuff like the SR-71 Blackbird or the B-58 Hustler or the XB-70 Valkyrie, which are all very cool looking planes, I might add. But none of them really worked out because, Soviet SAM systems continued to develop. They got faster and faster, and it just became less and less practical to develop like a really fast bomber. All the more so since bombers are like really big. But it didn't stop them from trying. And actually, in the 1980s, the Reagan administration resurrected the B-1 bomber program. It had been canceled in the 70s. It was thought to be an expensive boondoggle. But the Reagan administration wanted to use it as a kind of signal to the Soviets that we were going to compete with them in the Cold War again, at least in terms of military spending. And so they brought it out and they actually produced a few. And it's a very attractive plane. It's got lots of nice curves. It's just really cool looking, but it was never all that practical in the grand scheme of things. It was just a really expensive toy, basically. And I actually remember, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but I remember that the Air Force didn't entirely know what to do with them. And so in order to kind of save money I don't want to say in the 1990s, they ended up creating a National Guard unit that was designed to fly them, maintain them, etc. And for those of you not familiar with the National Guard, some of you are like not from the United States and whatnot. The National Guard is a kind of reserve unit. It's a reserve organization in the United States that's comprised of basically soldiers that technically work for individual states. They're basically like mini militaries for individual states in the United States. And they take volunteers and whatnot, and they train kind of like regular soldiers, but they don't have as strict a training regime, and they don't have to serve like all the time. Basically, you only serve when the state calls you up, and they'll do that for things like natural disasters or some such, or civil unrest. And then they call you up, and you have to come, and then they give you a weapon, they give you the uniform and whatnot, and then you go out and you do whatever needs to be done. So the National Guard, due to a law that was passed in like the early mid 20th century, kind of got wrapped into the normal military hierarchy. Technically, they still work with the states, such that the federal government doesn't really have direct control over them, although it can declare an emergency and basically force the states to give control of them. But the quid pro quo basically is that the federal government pays for them. It'll pay for maintaining bases and equipment and whatnot, and in exchange, the states provide the manpower, basically, cover some of the costs, and have access to them in times of need. It actually used to be that they were militia. That was sort of the original genesis of the National Guard back in the day. If you read American history, you'll read about American militia forming to fight Native Americans, to fight wars, stuff like that. And what happened was in the mid 20th century, the federal government passed a law that basically formalized the militia system, so to speak, and formalized it in the form of the National Guard. And so the National Guard then kind of became, after the Cold War, a kind of heat sink for resources. Like basically it was a kind of cost-sharing program at that point. So the military could avoid having to give up more assets than they would have otherwise, because there was a lot of budget cuts after the Cold War ended and stuff. So one of the ways they wanted to save money without losing, the B-1 bombers is that they created a B-1 bomber National Guard unit in Arkansas. So for a while, the state of Arkansas had one of the most powerful strategic bomber forces in the world. I don't know how much direct control they had over them, but technically there was that B-1B Arkansas National Guard unit that always kind of humored me. I don't think they have it anymore. I think they've since shut that down, probably for the best. But yeah, that was done for a while. Yeah, B-1B is a cool plane, in other words. Long story short. How did I even get onto that? God.
We were talking about basically the springboard of this tangent was what is it called? The multiple different types of arms that you need to win?
Combined arms.
Combined arms, yes. You had 3 hours of sleep. It's fine, man.
Combined arms, question mark, B-1B Lancers, profit.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, and I made the comment about F-16s being an old plane, but...
Block upgrades, that's what I was talking about, B-52s, and then I was talking about, okay, they tried to replace them with a more modern bomber, the B-1, but it was too expensive, and so they ended up just staying with the B-52s.
Mm-hmm.
And so we pretty much had that. We did also develop the B-2 Spirit, the big stealth bomber, which is also a cool plane, but those are super expensive and they're very specialized. They were never, I think, designed to replace the B-52. That was meant to be more of a specialist aircraft for World War III. We're gonna use those to bomb Moscow and whatnot.
Hmm.
Yeah, I can't remember what the newest thing is. XB something. Somebody in chat has to know. There's like a new bomber program, XB something. They're supposed to be working on that. I haven't read as much about it, so I'm not up to date on it.
Yeah, and one thing that I was learning about with U.S. fighter planes was they have these companies, like someone mentioned one in the chat just now. What was it? Northrop Grumman, and there's also Lockheed Martin, two last names together, where the U.S. government will say, we need a super crazy good plane that can do this, 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 and this. Whoever wins the contract is going to get a huge amount of money. So they get all these super, super smart people to put their heads together and design some ridiculously strong plane against another company that's also trying to do the same thing. So the competition ends up making the quality of the end result a lot better. And I would guess it's fairly different from how Russia does it. Do you know what their method is? For a lot of that innovation, do they just use a government department and say, go make this?
That's a good question, and I don't really know the answer. I don't think Russia has really had the resources to engage in the kinds of competitions the US has, because those are pretty expensive. The US government kind of covers a lot of the costs of doing that. So when you have multiple companies creating multiple aircraft and whatnot, the costs add up pretty quick. And I don't know that there's been a whole lot of new aircraft developed in Russia. I've seen a few. There's like the Sukhoi 57, like the MiG 1, what is it? The MiG 1.42,
Mm-hmm.
some weird designation like that. That's a cool looking plane, actually. I keep talking about cool looking planes. I'm kind of revealing my origins as an aerospace nerd way back in the day. But yeah, the Russians have developed some new experimental planes that are really cool looking in the past couple decades, but they haven't had the kinds of competitions for new aircraft that the United States has had. So I don't even know that they've really been developing a whole lot of new aircraft at this point. From what I've seen, most of what they do is take older designs and kind of update them. And not quite like the United States with the block upgrades. They'll actually change the frame and kind of modify the frame to produce something that's almost a new model.
Mm-hmm.
Basically the same aircraft, but with some adjustments. They'll add some canards, they'll add some different features here and there, and of course they'll spruce up the avionics package. That's sort of the main thing that they'll upgrade. So that's how you end up with like the Sukhoi 27, the Sukhoi 33, the Sukhoi 35, the Sukhoi 37. They all sound like different aircraft, but actually, if you look at them, they're all very similar. They're basically the same plane with slight modifications. So I think that's been more the Russian defense industry's model for the past couple decades. And if I'm wrong, please correct me. I would love to know. I would love to know how they do it exactly. But I think their model at this point is not developing whole new planes and having competitions for them. I think they just give contracts to certain defense industries to modify existing planes and to try to basically stay in the defense market. The defense industry is a major employer in Russia, and it's a major source of foreign currency. And as such, it's kind of strategically important for Russia to ensure that those industries continue to survive. And again, because they can't really, well, it's not that they can't innovate, they just don't really have the money to compete on the same terms as a lot of other international defense contractors. They kind of depend on the Russian government giving them funding to try to continually produce new products that can generate new revenue.
Yeah,
So they're just,
I did see a big infographic thing that showed the arms imports from the US and from the Soviet Union, which later becomes Russia. And they definitely sell a lot of stuff to a lot of different countries. It's not quite a east versus west split, but there's a lot of that overlap where Russia's selling a lot of their planes and their tanks and their stuff to countries who need that kind of stuff for defense or attacking or whatever.
yeah, it's a long list. They have contracts all over the world. They've been pushing into Africa recently. They've still got ties with countries they were allied with in the Cold War. Yeah, they've definitely still got ties, but it's a competitive marketplace. China produces increasingly effective stuff and at lower prices. So they're feeling pressure there. And then there's sort of new entrants into the market that have been making headway, like South Africa and the Emiratis, the UAE.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's Israel too, but they kind of have they kind of have a special role in the defense market. They have the privilege of having special access to the US defense market, which is probably the largest in the world. So they tend to cater more to our tastes than they do trying to find new markets, although
Mm-hmm.
they occasionally do. They've gotten in trouble for selling drones and stuff to countries that the U.S. government didn't really want them to. But for the most part, they're kind of attached at the hip with the U.S. defense industry. Yeah, South Africa and the Emiratis, in contrast, they'll sell to pretty much anybody. They don't care.
Yeah, I saw some articles of critiques of different uh, government leaders in Africa who were backing Russia with the invasion, but then there are people who are commenting saying, well, they buy their arms and weapons from Russia, and maybe their regime was helped set up by a lot of that sort of contribution. So similar to how the U.S. tends to like tip the scales in one way or another by giving one side military aid, Russia does that as well.
Well, in Russia's case, they've kind of their principal diplomatic gains in Africa over the past decade, let's say, have come in the form of the Wagner Group. I've talked before about like Francafrique,
Mm-hmm.
the French sphere of influence in West Africa,
Mm-hmm.
and how the Russians have been pushing into it. Like a lot of states that had been aligned more with France have kind of abandoned France, or even
Mm-hmm.
explicitly abandoned France. They kind of made a point of it in some cases, so that they could invite in the Russians, specifically in the form of Wagner Group mercenaries, to try to help them fight with insurgent groups, bandits, what have you, and to also help prop up authoritarian governments, frequently governments that had seized power in a previous coup.
Mm-hmm.
So those kind of are more the governments in Africa that have been the most vocal about supporting Russia. The older alliances that Russia has in Africa, the ones that date from the Cold War, have not quite been as reliably vocal in their support. And that's because a lot of those countries are actually more pro-China now than they are pro-Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So like a really good example would be Angola. Angola had been a Portuguese colony up until the 1970s. And obviously, people in Africa in the mid 20th century had about had enough of European colonialism. So, in those countries that did not get their independence in the 1950s or 1960s, there were almost always massive revolts. And that's what happened in the 1960s in the Portuguese Empire in Africa. There was a whole bunch of nationalist revolts in their African colonies, specifically in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there was really one in Cape Verde, but there might have been. I'm not sure. Let me squeeze in here the usual disclaimer. This would be a good time for it. I'm not an expert in most of the things I talk about on here, but if I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So if I ever say anything that's wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me in chat. Uh, I don't read chat while I do this, but I will read it later. So I will see what you're writing. I get a lot out of the feedback we get on it here. It's a lot of fun. So participation is encouraged. But yeah, with that said, Angola, for example, is a major oil exporter. And what happened is that in, I want to say the 90s or aughts or so, most of the Angolan oil industry became in part owned. It's actually technically like a national asset. It was nationalized by the government, but if you look at how governments who nationalize their oil sector actually run it, they generally allow a certain percentage of the state oil firm to be owned by foreign companies in exchange for technical support, investment money, etc. Generally, developing countries don't have the resources or expertise to really run an oil industry by themselves. So they do some sharing, they do allow some investment there. And in Angola's case, a good chunk of the state oil company is actually owned by Chinese oil firms, specifically state-owned oil firms. And as a result, Angola is now much closer to China now than it is to Russia. And I might add that Angola exports most of their oil to China as well. So it's not even just that they get most of their technical support from Sinopec, China's principal state-owned oil company. China is also their biggest buyer. So that relationship is pretty close. Um, so they haven't really been too gung-ho about, Russia's little misadventure in Ukraine. They're kind of like, that's unfortunate for you. Best of luck with that. But the Wagner Group countries up in West Africa, they've been very vocally pro-Russian. There was even like one dude, I don't even know who it was. He was like a soldier or mercenary or something. And he was a African guy, and I guess he was the head of a militia or something, and he made like I don't I almost want to say it was a TikTok video. It was some kind of social media video in which he said that he supported Russia fully and that he and his people were going to volunteer to go and fight with them in Ukraine. Yeah, I believe he was from the Central African Republic. So, I don't want to knock fighters from West Africa, and I'm sure they're very brave and whatnot, but African militaries and militias certainly are not really known for being the most well-trained or well-equipped fighting forces in the world. So, if Russia is in fact importing fighters from West Africa, certainly the most war-torn parts of West Africa, no less, that really shows how desperate they are for manpower. That's not really the kind of thing you do unless you just really, really need people.
Mm-hmm. I've heard that South Africa has pretty notorious mercenaries.
Yeah, that's different. That's way different. Yeah, Wagner Group mercenaries are basically an extension of the Russian government, and they basically act as basically an asset that they can trade. The Russians trade security in the form of Wagner Group mercenaries in exchange for access to resources. They'll let the countries that have Wagner Group mercenaries will generally give shares or even full ownership of natural resource commodities, things like mines and whatnot, to corporations that are associated with the Wagner Group. So it's basically diplomacy by other means, a kind of clandestine diplomacy. South African mercenaries, in contrast, were like hardcore mercenaries, like the very definition of mercenary. Like, we will kill people for money, for you, if you can afford it. So that was the most famous example, I think, was a mercenary group called Executive Outcomes. And they were an outfit that were hired to basically fight and win civil wars. There was a whole spat of civil wars in Africa in the mid 90s, and Executive Outcomes played a relatively significant role in a number of them. I think specifically in West Africa. I want to say they were in Liberia, maybe? Or maybe it was Sierra Leone. I don't quite remember exactly. But yeah, they were a major determining factor, like, in the course of the fighting. Like, there was no fighting force on the ground there that could even like come close to matching their ability. So, those were all guys that were veteran fighters who had been in like the South African military, generally special forces. So they were very well trained and very well armed. They had like the best equipment that money could buy, that kind of thing. So that actually led to a new rule that basically banned mercenaries in international conflicts. You're not really supposed to do that. That rule has kind of been watered down in the past 10 years. In Iraq, the United States used quote unquote private military contractors, which is kind of mercenaries. They kind of sidestepped the term. Because they were employed by the U.S. military, they were sort of legally counted as part of the U.S. military. So they weren't technically mercenaries, but in effect they were. This is where you get groups like Blackwater that have since become notorious, as led by the notorious Eric Prince. Eric Prince has been in all kinds of adventures. That's a whole other topic of discussion. But most mercenary groups are generally more competent than Blackwater, though. I would point out that Blackwater is not the best example.
Why are they not competent?
Oh, dude, there's like a whole list of misadventures they've got. They were involved in a coup attempt in Jordan, just totally failed miserably. They got in a huge amount of trouble in Iraq for just being super casual about killing civilians. Like, what would happen is that well, I'll give you the best case study. There was a case where Blackwater mercenaries were just in a car, just traveling down a road, and there was some gunfire. I don't know if they were shooting at them or if it was just like it was just like a car making noise or something, but they thought they were being shot at, and they just opened up on everybody around them. Like they weren't shooting at anything in particular. They just opened up on all the people in that whole area around the car as they were driving, and just killed a whole bunch of civilians doing it. That incident was particularly notorious, and that actually resulted in them changing their name. They ended up changing their name to something like C or some bullshit. They've since changed it back, I believe. But yeah, it's not the most well-disciplined outfit, and whenever they get paid to do something, they almost invariably end up fucking it up somehow.
Yeah, it seems like if your business is doing stuff in war, choosing which jobs you take has a major impact on your name. Like if you take a job where the side is heavily favored to lose, then that's really risking yourself and your people and stuff.
Yeah.
And then you also don't really have as much of an incentive to do the job cleanly as like a government force would, because the retaliation isn't quite the same against mercenaries as it is against a
Yeah, there's
nation.
not the same sort of legal responsibility.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that also depends. Like in the US, there's still a lot of laws that apply, even if you're a military contractor. The real issue is when you get guys like the mercenaries fighting for the Wagner Group in Africa, or mercenaries fighting for like Libyan warlords in the Libyan civil war. That's been a thing too.
Hmm.
Some of those guys have been American. They actually hired some American pilots to go fly in whatever passes for an air force in eastern Libya. I don't even want to call it like an air force. They actually smuggled in dust croppers and then they put bombs on them and they hired American pilots to fly them. It was the weirdest shit. But technically that counts. Technically those guys are mercenaries. So in those cases, there's not as much legal responsibility because the legal environment in the areas where they're fighting is, well, there basically is no legal environment. There's no rule of law during a major civil war like the one in Libya. So in those cases, yeah, there can be a lot of abuses, and there's like a big, moral hazard where there's so much discretion on the part of the mercenaries that they can literally get away with murder if they want. Which is why the international ban was put in place in the first place. I don't know that Executive Outcomes was responsible for a whole lot of human rights abuses, but they definitely were killing a lot of people, in the war.
The other country question that we had before we got started was on Switzerland taking a stance in this conflict, which is a country which has been known as a neutral nation for a long time, but I don't think anyone is ever really completely neutral. But they've been joining in with the application of sanctions and limitations on what Russian money is doing in their country. So some people were asking about that. If Switzerland
Yeah, they've been a lot more proactive than you would expect a neutral country to be.
Mm-hmm.
You would expect them to kind of take the stance that, oh, that's, the invasion is terrible, we condemn it, but economic interests are paramount, so we're not going to do anything. But in fact, they seized Russian assets, they sanctioned Russian assets. They've been a proactive partner of the West in going after Russia's economic interests. So that was definitely a break from established precedent. They went out of their way to participate in that regard. So not really neutral in this case.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they've contributed any military forces. So in that sense, they're still staying out of that aspect of the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as sanctions and whatnot, yeah, they're definitely on board. Yeah, that's part of a general trend towards financially decoupling from Russia and Russian investment. Because oligarchs in Russia, as well as just wealthy people in general in Russia, in and out of the government, they'll put their assets in the West because the West has rule of law and their assets are safer as a result there. Keep your stuff in Russia and it's going to get seized as part of some power struggle at some point. So it's just less risky to invest abroad. But the result then is that there's been a lot of Russian influence in Western financial markets, and that's resulted in a particular spike in Russian influence in the parts of Europe where the financial sector is a very important part of the economy. So Switzerland is one example, but also there are, even more prominent examples like Londongrad, the famous example where London, where the financial sector is so important, had so much money coming in from Russians that it was home to a number of Russian oligarchs, wealthy elite, etc. And they played a growing role in British politics, funding this, that, or the other political party and buying assets from politically connected firms. There was a lot of skeevy activity going on there under the surface. But to London's credit, they've been trying to sever those relationships. I think they ended the visa scheme. A lot of countries have visa schemes where they give you a visa if you invest a certain amount of money. I think they call them golden visas or some such. So they've been winding that program down because obviously, people were abusing the shit out of that. So that's over. They've been seizing assets, of course, that belong to the Russian government as well as to targeted Russian individuals. So it seems Londongrad is in its terminal stages now. It seems on the way out. So that's another example. Cyprus is another example. A big chunk of Cyprus's economy is actually the financial sector, and a big chunk of the financial sector is pretty much just Russian dark money, just coming into the country to be laundered. That was a big deal in 2008 during the during the financial crisis then, and then again during the Eurozone crisis a few years later. A lot of the actions that were taken to try to stabilize international finances disrupted the flow of Russian money to Cyprus and caused some economic problems for them. But now they're facing sort of a financial apocalypse because all that Russian money now is about to be cut off as a result of sanctions. And the Cypriot government even came out and basically said, do we really want to do this? Do we really have to do this? This is going to pretty much gut our economy. Maybe we can do this a little differently. They were thinking maybe we could, slowly roll out sanctions over time, or maybe we could just have fewer sanctions, certain people and industries, rather than just, the total gamut, like what the Europeans and Americans are doing. But it seems the European Union is not really going to give them much of a choice. They're kind of leaning on them to participate fully in the sanctions regime. So Cyprus is facing a kind of economic reckoning as a result. And the government is having a bad time, suffice to say, on account of it. I think there's a couple others. What? London, Switzerland, Cyprus. I guess those would be the main ones. Maybe Monaco, but finance hasn't been a big deal in Monaco, I don't think. That's just more of like rich people Las Vegas.
Mm-hmm.
Luxembourg, maybe. Luxembourg has a lot of finance, but I think that's more the technical side of finance rather than investment flows. So I don't know that they'll be all that impacted. Yeah, there will probably be a bigger impact in places like outside of Europe, like just as big an impact in places outside of Europe, like the Cayman Islands and other British overseas territories. A lot of those territories make their money by sort of discreetly allowing themselves to be used to launder money. There's a lot of dark money that runs through those areas. They're heavily deregulated. There's very low taxation. Basically they have set themselves up as tax havens, but also that makes them very attractive for people looking to kind of hide money and move money around as part of this, that, or the other political power game. So there's not only a lot of Russian dark money there's a lot of Chinese dark money, and a lot of money that gets laundered from the developing world as well. One of the fun statistics I read when I was doing research back in 2021 about China's economy, you've heard of the Belt and Road program, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so China invests money overseas in infrastructure projects or, whatever kind of project that they can get a country to sign on to. And the program is relatively opaque, so we don't really entirely know where all the money goes. But we do have a couple public sources of information from China. And one author basically aggregated them together and tried to make a list of the countries that received the most Belt and Road investment money. And one of the fun findings is that among the top 10 countries were the Cayman Islands and the Turks and Caicos Islands. Basically these little islands that are known for being tax havens. Now, there's no way that, just tens of billions of dollars in Chinese investment money is actually being invested in those little island economies. They would not have anywhere near enough investment opportunities to justify that. So almost certainly that the Chinese are basically funneling that money in. I should say the Chinese government is funneling that money into those tax havens so that they can hide where they're actually sending it. So that gives you an idea of how the economies in these overseas territories work. And the Russians, no doubt, have been funneling no small amount of money into those islands as well. So they'll probably take a hit from being cut off from that, assuming, of course, that they actually do participate and they don't sabotage the sanctions, which is also possible. Private sector firms are pretty wily when they want to be, so they could do that. But I suspect the British government is going to lean pretty hard on them not to. More so than they usually would, let's say. There's rather more impetus now. Yeah, Switzerland has had it a little bit rough because it used to be that they had a very hard line on their neutrality policy and an even more hard line on their secret banking. That was one of the things that really distinguished Swiss banking. It was totally anonymous if you wanted it to be. And that worked for them for a long time up until the 2008 financial crisis. And then it became apparent that, the impetus created by the 2008 financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis that followed it is that there was a big drop in tax revenue in Europe. And so a lot of European states started trying to scrape the barrel and find whatever they could. And that meant, in part, trying to go after tax evaders. And as part of the strategy that was developed to deal with that, the European Union, basically as a whole, put a lot of pressure on countries that were known for being tax havens in order to provide more information about European citizens who were exploiting laws like secret banking laws and whatnot to try to evade taxes in the continent. And the pressure brought to bear was successful. And the result is that Switzerland ended up having to moderate their policies a little bit on secret banking. And they've been much more open since that time as a result. So now they're kind of getting ahead of the gun, so to speak. Getting ahead of the curve, rather. They know that they're going to face a lot of pressure from Europe to participate in sanctions like they did back in, 2014. So rather than try to fight it, why not just go along with it and avoid the tension? Ireland came under similar pressure back in the day for that same reason. Ireland tried to build an economy out of low corporate taxes and low regulation. And as a result, they were able to become the so-called Celtic Tiger. They were able to incur no small amount of economic growth as a result, but their economy became inordinately dependent on banking as a result. So when the financial crisis hit in '08, they had a problem.
Yeah, it's going to hit them extra hard.
Yeah. Iceland was the same way, actually. Iceland and Ireland had similar models in that regard. So not only did they get disproportionately hit by the '08 financial crisis, they also had to deal with a kind of diplomatic crisis when they came under pressure from Europe to try to mitigate some of those policies in order to mitigate the space for tax evaders. I might add that Go ahead.
There was a documentary that I watched that talked about some of the tax havens within the United States, like the continental U.S. There's a lot of attention on Swiss banking and offshore accounts like Cayman Islands and stuff like that. But if you're from somewhere outside the U.S. and you're storing money in the U.S., that's quite secure. And some of it is pretty shady. South Dakota was mentioned as one example. I think Nevada is also an example where the rules are very, very libertarian, which means that you can put a lot of money there. And I can't remember the type of, maybe it's a trust is what it's called. If you put your stuff in a trust in the US, then you're basically saying that I trust someone else to handle this stuff and I can put a large amount of money there and it's going to be managed by someone else and not looked at too much.
Yeah. Yeah, you have your assets managed by somebody else. You create a degree of separation between yourself and your assets. And what a lot of guys do is that, well, generally it'll be like a lawyer that you'll do that with. You'll have a lawyer, they'll take your assets, they'll set up the trust, and then they'll create another degree or even multiple degrees of further separation by creating shell companies overseas and whatnot. And so then the money kind of gets spread around. And as a result, it's very difficult for the law to keep track of who owns what, and in turn to enforce laws restricting access to this, that, or the other market or whatnot. So yeah, South Dakota, and I want to say Delaware too, do that. Their sort of models has been to deregulate corporate regulation. That's one of the reasons like all of your credit card companies are set up in Delaware and South Dakota. The laws for registering corporate charters is like super cheap there. And the usury laws are basically non-existent. It used to be that pretty much every state had usury laws. And if you don't know what a usury law is, that's a law that basically prohibits excessively high interest rates. But South Dakota and Delaware figured, our economies aren't doing too good. Why not try to attract some money by removing usury laws so that companies can charge as much as they want? So obviously the downside is high interest rates, but the upshot is that you get more business from corporate headquarters who set up in your state or at least register in your state to take advantage of that favorable law. When you do business with a credit card company, technically the laws that apply are the laws of the state in which the company is operating. I believe that's how it works. So because those companies all operate in either Delaware or South Dakota, the laws are very favorable to them as a result. And you generally end up with very high interest rates on your credit card bill, especially if you miss a payment, because almost all of those contracts come with caveats that if you miss a payment, then they get to charge a punishing interest rate, let's say, since I can't pronounce it right.
A punitive measure?
Thank you.
Got him.
Thank you. Austin's got my back, as usual. Much appreciated. Yeah, they'll jerk that interest rate up like 20 percentage points or something ridiculous. And that used to be explicitly illegal. It used to be you just could not do that. But because the laws were liberalized in, South Dakota and Delaware, all the companies moved there. So now that's just a thing that you get to live with.
Do you want to know some religious history for why those usury laws are pretty commonplace in the US?
Yeah, let me have it.
It's in the heckin' Bible, dude. One of the things that's a limitation on Christians that is not on some other religions is you're not supposed to lend at great interest or lend at any interest at all. So that's something that I think is kind of cooked into a lot of our laws. It's not an explicitly Christian law, but I believe that the history of that being seen as a bad thing and wanting to make sure that that's not out of hand is in the Bible somewhere. Maybe someone's a Bible scholar and they can say where exactly that is, or correct me if I'm making that up, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. That's another one of the reasons why a lot of people who are anti-Semitic and stuff, they're saying stuff about Jewish people controlling money. They didn't have a specific rule, because I think it was a New Testament, if you're looking at the Bible, a New Testament rule that you're not supposed to lend at a high rate. So they're like, well, we don't have a hang up about this in our religious text, but Christians do. So it's a niche that's open, kind of like how in the forest plants and trees will go and fill a spot where there's some sunlight.
Huh. Could you repeat that last bit?
Well, I just gave an example of like, it's an open niche where if people are refraining from doing business in this area for religious reasons, but you don't have that same religious reservation, you can just occupy that niche like a plant will rise to take up whatever gap there is in the available sunlight.
Gotcha. Right. Okay. Makes sense. And that was, you said New Testament, right?
New Testament, I believe, yeah. So it's a rule which applies to Christians and not Jewish people.
Huh. So it's not in, I guess it makes sense that it was not in the Old Testament.
Yeah. If it was in the Old Testament, it would apply to both. For people who are neither Christian nor Jewish and don't know about that, the Torah, which is the first books of the Bible and in the Old Testament, is It probably varies a little bit based on translation, but it's what the Jewish people follow, or people who are religiously Jewish. And then the New Testament is the book that defines what Christianity is. It's focused on the life and death of Christ. But any Bible that a Christian gets is going to have both the Old and the New Testament pretty much all the time.
Gotcha. Huh. So I guess that ties into like discrimination in Europe against Jews, kind of forcing them into professions that were basically open, like you were saying.
Yes.
Sort of the
So,
finding the sunlight.
yeah, they're being all sus about Jewish people in finance, but the Christians are opting out of doing that kind of financial work because they have a rule against it. Mm-hmm. So it's not as though there's a conspiracy, it's that there's a hang up for a particular reason that they're not getting involved in the space.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I think Islam has similar laws against usury. In the car. Okay, hold on. Quran? Is that it?
Quran?
Quran. I've usually I say Quran, but then chat kind of lit me up the last time I said it, was telling me I was pronouncing it wrong. So I think it was Quran, I think it was, is what they were saying. I don't quite remember.
I think if you're try-harding it and you're trying to pronounce it correctly, like absolutely correctly, it's something like Quran, where you emphasize it in that way.
Okay.
I haven't really practiced Arabic, so.
Me neither. We've been slacking Neuro.
Also, connected to the usual disclaimer, every news source has a bias and some limited scope in their perspective. And the two people in voice right now are two American citizens who speak English as their primary language and are, I believe, not religious. So if we said anything that is incorrect or offensive, we welcome corrections here. We're just trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. But I believe, that in Islam they have a prohibition against high interest rates, or even really charging interest at all, because there's such a thing as Islamic finance in the Middle East, and it's a major industry there. And the way it works is that they just, well, basically it's finance designed in such a way that there's technically no interest charged. Mm-hmm. But the lender still manages to make money. The way they do it is that when the lender lends money, the borrower has to give basically the lender some ownership over whatever company or project they're working on. And when it grows, later on, the lender can sell their share and get their money back. Well, not only get their money back, but get back a return so that it's profitable. So technically no interest rate is charged, but money is lended and there is a profit on the part of the lender. Mm-hmm. So technically they're honoring their religious obligations while still engaging in commerce, shall we say. Mm-hmm. Lots of loopholes in religion.
Yep, and then a lot of it comes down to how you interpret it too, and that's a major difference in what different branches of religion do, as well as different individuals who follow religion. Is they're looking at the same piece of text, but what does that mean? And if you interpret it in different ways, then you can kind of move forward with whatever your actions are with less qualms about it. Even if someone interprets it and says, no, we can't do this, period, they'll be like, well, we could do it like this, and then it wouldn't be against the rules, kind of a deal.
Yeah. Well, we've come a long way from Ukraine.
We have. We've been going on some fun tangents today. We got into planes, tanks. We got to go to Africa for a bit. Different parts of Africa. Touched on religion more than usual.
Gosh, what are some other... Well, was there anything in particular you wanted to kind of get to here?
I don't think so. We got our Ukraine territory update kind of a thing. The battles and such. Did you have any notes or things that you wanted to cover?
Oh yeah,
Oh, he's got
but
the notes.
most of it is Ukraine though, so I wanted to know if there was like another part of the world that you'd heard about or wanted to kind of touch on here.
I did see something about Taiwan looking to invest pretty heavily in a drone fleet of some kind after seeing what happened in Ukraine.
Hmm. No, I didn't see that.
Yeah.
I'll have to look into that. It would make sense,
Yeah.
certainly.
Yeah, the thing that you can kind of use as a comparison between StarCraft and military engagement is you have certain kinds of defender advantage and certain units you can make that are really good defensively, but maybe not quite as good offensively. So drones are really annoying, and if you're just firing them from where you are at home, you have a lot more access to strike at this or that objective that's nearby. You can't really like go across the world with drones because they're going to have a pretty limited flight range, but for defensive purposes, it seems to be a pretty good unit and a unit that punishes tanks pretty hard.
Yeah, enormously effective. But I don't know that tanks are necessarily their biggest problem in Taiwan. Their bigger problem is what would you say? Amphibious landings, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So, the naval element is more, I would imagine, what they're kind of focused on. Yeah, the trouble with Taiwan's military is that it's not the most cutting edge institution at this point. They've got some internal problems. It's not necessarily like equipment per se or training. It's more just the leadership is a little clannish. They kind of take for granted that they're going to stay in their job. They kind of take their jobs for granted a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And there's kind of an assumption that if there's a war with China, then the United States will inevitably kind of come and bail them out.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a little bit of moral hazard there as well. And one of the manifestations is that Taiwan's military and the Taiwanese government tends to spend too much money on prestige projects. They want to have like their own indigenously produced plane, their own indigenously produced tank, stuff like that. And all of that is really expensive, takes a lot of resources that would probably be better spent on things like readiness, better training, better equipment, imported from abroad, stuff like that. And there's also kind of a morale problem, so I've read. A lot of people in Taiwan don't always have the highest confidence that they would be able to defeat China on their own.
Mm.
The fact that they're so economically interdependent doesn't help matters much. Yeah, they don't really have like conscription either, like what Ukraine has. It used to be that Taiwan had a mandatory military service for men when they turned 18.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was like a year or two or something, but it was always very unpopular. And so the government eventually stripped it down to something like a couple months, and then they restricted the number that they took in every year, I believe. So the military says that it would be better if they had the old form of conscription so that they had a higher level of readiness, so that they had more people in the military at any given time.
Chad is saying
And
that
also
Taiwan has 4-month conscription.
4-month conscription, okay.
And the legislature
Yes.
is moving toward increasing it to 1 year.
Yeah, yeah, that would make sense. That's what the military has been asking for. Because then not only do you have more people in at any given time, well, I guess extending it to 1 year doesn't inherently mean you have more people, but the military also wants more people. So, in addition to wanting more people, having a longer term for conscription means that you have more time to train people
Mm-hmm.
so that once they leave the service, they have better training. Like, as is, just having a couple months of training and then leaving means that you're not really all that well trained. So, if they do need to call you up in an emergency, you're not going to be as combat effective as somebody who had like a whole year's training.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been a big critique from the military about the status quo. And a lot of politicians have not been willing to move on that because it's so unpopular. But I guess, Chad is saying that they're moving towards that. So it could be that Ukraine finally kicked them loose, so to speak.
Yeah, we have a country near and dear to the StarCraft scene that has military conscription, so many of us are just aware of the concept as a result of some of our pro gamers going away for a year and then coming back. South Korea has to do 1 year, so you'll see pro gamers like try to push in their gaming as much as possible, try to get the best tournament results they can, and then they say their goodbye. They take a picture with their buzzed haircut, and then they'll go away for a year. Sometimes they practice a little bit on the side. I have heard that within some of the branches of South Korean military, they'll have like a fun little side team of StarCraft because it's so centered to the culture over there, like esports and stuff. And a lot of their esports athletes are global icons, so they'll let certain players still practice with each other, and then they'll come out of retirement and sometimes compete again. We have some people like DRG and Classic, I think, who are back. They did their year of military service and they're back in GSO Code S, so they can get their skills back even if they take some time off. A lot of the pros will try to wait as long as they can and get as much value out of their young 20s as they can, and then they'll go at like 26, 27. There's some cutoff in your late 20s when you have to get it done by, and then they'll try to make their return.
How long do they generally stay in the industry?
Usually, I think the oldest pro gamers we have right now are early 30s, if I had to guess. If you're talking about people who are still playing near the top competitive level. Some of the best players in the world right now are early 20s, like Cyril, Rayner, and Clem are all younger than 25. But you can still be pretty competitively viable as you're approaching 30.
Huh.
I'm a very crusty 32. I don't really feel too much slower. I think one of the factors for having a younger brain for StarCraft is you're very kinetically fast, where you can just respond to stuff that isn't really a highbrow intellectual thought. It's like click and move this shit over here really fast without thinking about it too much. And when you're younger, you tend to have less hesitation about that, and you also recover from heavy practice faster. That's another thing that has been a struggle for a lot of StarCraft pros, like Flash as an example. He had to get surgery to his arm just because of the intense heavy use over time, and as you age, your healing factor goes down. So that's why younger people are better at esport games than older people, especially for a game as mechanically intensive as StarCraft. I don't know about other game genres like first-person shooters and MOBA games. Maybe someone in chat can weigh in on that, but I think in StarCraft we have such intense mechanics for how fast you need to be moving your mouse hand and your keyboard hand all the time that if you're practicing for 8 to 10 hours a day, and if you have any other complicating risk factors, you can injure yourself pretty easily.
Yikes.
Yep.
Well, I guess there are worse ways to injure yourself in the grand scheme of things, but yeah, that's got to suck if your whole livelihood is tied up in it, and then you kind of lose the ability for, what, a couple weeks, couple months.
Yeah, players like Flash and stuff, though, are still god tier, even though they've been injured and been practicing so much, so it's pretty cool. And it does show the aspect of esports being a form of athleticism, not purely a intellectual endeavor. That would be the difference between chess and StarCraft, is StarCraft has the capacity to really be a strain on your physical body where you need to account for injury and work on your injury prevention. I think Finland also has military conscription of some kind. I remember reading something about maybe an athletic exemption, which Cyril might be getting. Cyril won IEM Katowice, which was the new BlizzCon, basically. It used to be the World Championship was held at BlizzCon every year, but since BlizzCon didn't happen, and Blizzard's had a bit of a struggle with their name recently too, so I would guess even if they did, they would have more protests than the last one that I attended. But Cyril won again, and he's the Finnish phenom, so we'll see what he does. Maybe he's already out and he doesn't have to do
And didn't
conscription.
they get bought out by Microsoft recently?
Yes.
Have you
Microsoft
seen
bought
any?
out Blizzard Activision.
That's what it was. Okay. Have you seen any changes stemming from that yet?
We got a patch, which I don't think we got a patch because of that buyout. It was mainly from things that were set up beforehand, which is a community group that talks to each other. It's a mixture of like casters, pro gamers, and things like that. And there is still some people working on StarCraft, and they were talking to this community group and being like, "Hey, what is the most oppressive and overpowered in the game?" And they did a slew of nerfs to stuff. They nerfed some Zerg stuff, some Terran stuff, and some Protoss stuff. It was so weird because many of us had resigned ourselves to the fate that they had just abandoned the offices and no one cared anymore and this kind of thing. But then the buyout with Microsoft happened, and they had the big StarCraft logo on the front and center, kind of showing that they had that IP now, which we were like, wow, they're proud to have StarCraft. We're pretty excited about that. And then we got a heckin' patch, which wasn't a major patch that changed a whole bunch of stuff in a big way, but it took the stuff that was like the most obviously strong and it just tuned it back a little bit. So it's been a pretty good shift for us.
Okay. Well, is there any expectation they'll kind of keep that up?
Yeah, if something does get out of hand, then they'll hit it with the nerf bat again, probably with a similar group of people looking at the results in top tournaments and things like that. The thing is, the game is pretty balanced now compared to previous phases of the game where you could just make this Broodlord Infestor stuff and nobody could stop you or this or that. They've gradually nerfed the most broken strategies. And then the cool thing about a game of strategy like this is there may be some styles undiscovered that are really strong that people haven't been trying yet. And if they do figure that out and then they start spamming it and nobody can stop it and the games get too monotonous, then they might tune things back.
Sure.
But Brood War is still alive and well, and they haven't changed or patched that game in a very long time.
Why would you want to? Oh.
Yeah, the players sort of balance the game in a way too, just by finding counter strategies to stuff. It does kind of like how water flows. Strategies tend to flow in a direction where they can deal with the most oppressive strategies and also have the greatest chances to deal damage and take wins. I ended up making a StarCraft 2 unit tier list because I was invited onto the Pylon show recently, which is the longest running and current talk show in the StarCraft scene. And they were putting things in S tier, A tier, B tier, and D tier. And you just go through the units and decide, okay, this is a really bad unit, this is a really good unit, that kind of a thing. Pretty fun. There are some units that at one point in the game were really strong and they've nerfed them so many times that they're not too good anymore. And then some units that are recently discovered to be good. An example is the Ghost. The Ghost is a unit that was quite rare for a long time, and then people figured out that they could bind rapid fire to the snipe ability and then just like wave their cursor over, which used to take a whole bunch of clicks, but they can do it with way fewer clicks now, and just wipe out very expensive armies with it. And that changed the balance of the late game for Terran pretty substantially. So it's interesting that you can have a discovery of a mechanic like that pretty late into the game's life, and then it ends up balancing things. Like the Terrans were notorious for complaining super hard about Protoss all the time, and then as some of the pros started using Ghosts more often, they were just winning with these strats, and they're like, oh, are we actually overpowered?
Ugh. I haven't played RTSs in a long time. I'm a little out of the loop.
Yeah. People are still swinging away at it.
Did you see that YouTube video about whether or not the next RTS would fail?
Yep.
Now, I didn't actually watch that. I just noted that there was a whole shit ton of reaction videos that popped up on my recommendations. And I was
Yes.
like, wow, this must be a topic of conversation. I should ask Neuro about it.
Yeah, one of the things that is a big credit to some of these Blizzard games is they have a ridiculous amount of polish on them, where they've just patched it so many times and figured out all the stuff that's really busted and annoying and chipped away at it to the point where for any other RTS game to step into that arena, they're going to have years and years of patches that they have to do to bring it up to that level of fairness and fun. So it's a very long-term investment. If you want to get in the game of being the next big RTS on the block, or like people talk about all the time with World of Warcraft, if you want to be the big MMO on the block, you've got to do a ton of work, and when you release your game, it's going to suck compared to World of Warcraft or compared to StarCraft. And that's just how it's going to be. So I don't think the next big RTS will necessarily fail. There's the Frost Giant team now, which is a lot of people who are on the StarCraft 2 team. I joked about it at some point, kind of like how the spirit of Sauron endured in the Lord of the Rings, and even though he was slain in battle, the ring survived, so Sauron survived. It seems like the soul of the StarCraft 2 team persisted, and it's Frost Giant now. So they're working on an RTS project, and a lot of people expect that to be the next main contender for another big RTS. Age of Empires 4 came out recently, but it's a very different feel from StarCraft. It doesn't feel like it was meant to be an esport in the same way that StarCraft 2 was. Because if you're making an RTS, you can make one that's just for the most fair and realistic RTS kind of battles, or you can have one that's meant to be entertaining minute by minute. And that was a thing that StarCraft was very clear about wanting to do, is they wanted the games to be exciting to watch, not just fair, not just fast, but really fun for the spectator. And that means that there are certain elements of the game that an RTS purist might be upset by, like the lethality of offense units is really high. So if you want to go for an attack, it's easier to execute an attack than it is to do the defense. In real life, it's not really the case, but if you make defense way easier than attack, then nobody's going to attack, and the games are going to be pretty boring. So that was one thing, and then the shift from starting out with 6 workers to 12 workers means that you cut down on a lot of the low action period in the early game. There was someone in my chat yesterday, actually, who was complaining about this. They were saying, man, I really liked when there was a calm before the storm. And as a player, I totally get that. Like, it's kind of annoying to have a plan and then someone is just, like, all-inning you at the very start and you can't really do your plan at all. But if you're a spectator or a caster, you're looking at 2 players who are more or less just going through the motions of doing something that you have to do every time that doesn't really involve any key decisions or a ton of skill. So they just said, let's just skip that phase of the game. It's boring for the casters, it's boring for the top pros, it's boring for the spectators, but for a lot of players, they feel like they're thrown into a race at a running start because the action picks up so fast. But yeah, I have hope for RTS. It's a cool genre. It has a lot of satisfaction in being able to move multiple parts of stuff. I've heard from some people they like RTS just because they like organizing things, not necessarily because they want to cast an opponent to the ground. I like the competitive aspect where I feel like I can take complete credit for the victory if I win, and I also have complete responsibility if I lose. So it makes it a lot less muddy than if you're playing Overwatch or Dota 2 or something where you have 5 to 6 people all making mistakes together. Whose fault was it that we lost? That's what a lot of people do in those team games, is they try to focus on who the scapegoat is and then yelling at that person and calling them bad and telling them to quit the game. In StarCraft, you have that nice, beautiful silence of the match is over and you lost. You can either blame yourself or you can blame the developers who made the game for it being unfair. But you can't blame any teammates.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Also, respect for teaching me all that while still also playing StarCraft 2 at the same time.
Hell yeah.
Well played, sir.
Yeah, it's kind of like riding a bike where a lot of the moves that I'm doing while we're doing Agent Smith, I've done thousands of times before, and I'm not quite as aggressive, but I know that these are my different benchmarks. Like I need to take a base, I need to be droning this and that. I think my opponent's attacking, I'm going to make some units. Some days when we do this Agent Smith, I'm just getting cheesed constantly, and the games are pretty brutal and I lose a bunch, but other times you get some nice wins.
Cool. Well, I appreciate you flexing that muscle on the behalf of the segment. Very
Heck yeah.
cool.
Yeah, I think that's one of my gifts as a person is my like kinetic speed and instinct. I'm more of an intuitive person than a planner. So if I just throw myself into a situation, being able to improvise is something that I tend to have an edge on. Having a really cool plan or a structured build, I'm not really a structured person, but if I put myself in a position of pressure where I need to perform, I tend to like that and have fun.
Yeah, you kind of shared that with Michael. Both of you were very high in terms of situational awareness.
Mm-hmm.
You were always very present in the moment and always very good at planning things out in the moment.
Yeah.
Pretty good long-term planners too, I might add. You've made a nice little home for yourself on here, and that was no accident.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember the exact stage when that happened, but this is kind of some old Neuro stream lore. You see Kukio at the top of the contributors list for the stream, and he was basically the patron for my efforts both in poker and in StarCraft. And the initial one was his idea for me to try poker because I had brain science as my background and I knew a lot about human cognition and human bias, and I took these classes like judgments and decision making, and I was like, man, humans make a bunch of predictable errors and people place bets for money at the poker table. This is so fucked. We can get rich. Let's do it. And he's like, yeah, you're bright, you have the background, you have the skills, I'll show you what I know about poker. And he took me to the casino a few times and we put some hands in and talked about them and tried to learn and stuff like that. And we even moved to Vancouver, Canada, which you visited there.
Yep.
And I set up a bank account in Canada because, God bless America, poker is illegal in Texas. Texas Hold'em is illegal in Texas unless you're on a reservation. So set up the account there and then played some micro stakes online and honestly got my ass handed to me. And I had a huge humbling for myself as a person where I fancied myself a very bright young lad where I was just smarter than people and a bit of an elitist. And if I was sitting at the poker table and there were people who are not as smart as me there, I was just going to win by my nature. That's not how the world works. These are deep games of skill that require years of learning and study and practice, and you have to make a lot of the mistakes along the way. So I got destroyed and I felt bad, and then I researched the game and I was like, oh man, I don't even know what these words mean. So I studied for a long time, and my rough regimen whenever I was training poker was I would read from a book while I had coffee and breakfast in the morning and take notes and highlight and underline certain stuff in the book. And then I would put hands in for a period of time. And then after I put the poker hands in online, I would go over the biggest pots and kind of see, did I take a good betting line here, that kind of a thing. And gradually took a small sum of money and turned it into more money. And Kukio is with us through that whole process, kind of talking with me along the way. I remember the day when I had my worst beat online. I was so fucking mad. There was a situation where a person had 3 of a kind, and I had 5 in a row, I believe, which is a straight. And there was one card in the deck which could save them, which would be the 4th of that type. And for them to pursue that hand as far as they did was kind of silly, given that the straight was pretty obvious on the board. So they were making a really, really bad decision, and they were going to lose any time other than when they get that 4th card. And they got it, which meant I lost a big chunk of money because I was all in there. And I was really pissed because I was like, how, they're so dumb. Like, it was really obvious that I had this, blah, blah, blah. But you just have to accept that as a poker player, that sometimes the worst play wins the hand in the short term. And being a good player is about making the long-term play that's going to win more often, and that's called plus expected value. So there's that poker journey, and then we're thinking about going back to Texas. He gets an offer for a big pay increase and stuff, but he needs to be in the office in Texas, so we agreed to go down there. But the flip side is I would be a criminal if I'm going to continue to play poker and stuff there. So I was saying, hey, I've been playing StarCraft while I was up in Canada, and I got up to Diamond League. Ooh, wow. And what if I took a lot of this mindset stuff that I've been reading in poker, and what if I did a Road to GM StarCraft stream, and I tried to teach people about tilt management? And Michael said, yeah, I believe in you. You can do that. And I was like, well, I won't make any money for a long time. And he said, it's okay. I saw what you did with poker. I trust you. So me making exactly $0 per hour, spamming hours and trying to get good at StarCraft, he gave me this opportunity to be here streaming for you. So bless. Thank you, Michael. Having faith in people means that they can accomplish a lot more than they could otherwise, especially if you help them out in a big way when they're at a point in their career where they don't really have as much to show for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was always a good judge of character.
Yeah, he reminded me of the kind of Renaissance man from back when it was fashionable to just bankroll some crazy young scientist who had some fucked up idea that no one had ever tried before. And they're like, yeah, I'm just going to throw money at this because I think it sounds cool. He would do that. And he was very liberal with who he would help out. If there's someone in trouble, he'll just send him some money. Very generous in that sense.
Yeah. Awesome dude, and I still miss him.
Yep. You lived with us for a while there in Texas when we moved back. You basically had your corner in the living room where you could sleep on the couch and you had your PC hooked up to it, and I would stream, and then at the end of the stream we'd go out there in the living room and we would just like watch some history documentary or something and then talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah, those were the good old days.
Mm-hmm.
I remember them fondly.
Yep.
I wish things could have turned out different, but so it goes.
Yep. You get some Neuro backstory there. You loving the origin story? Hell yeah.
Have you not told that story before?
I've told it before. But the thing with a Twitch stream is you don't have the exact same people in the chat all the time, so there are some like long-term regulars who likely have heard that before, and then some people who are newer or just who weren't there whenever the story was being told, kind of a thing.
Gotcha. Well, let's see. I guess yeah, we went on some tangents there. Did you want some more Ukraine stuff? I've got all manner of things for you.
Sure. If you've got notes, you can fire away.
Let's see. Well, I'll send you this first. This isn't something I don't mean to like send you stuff and then as an implicit request that you show it on stream. Sometimes I just send you stuff for you to look at. So I'm gonna send you a video here of like a traditional Ukrainian folk song. And it's just got a nice little music video that shows some traditional Ukrainian clothing. It's pretty neat. Let's see. And what else did we have here? Oh, did I tell you about the Krasuka 4?
No? What's that?
Good question. It's a quote-unquote mobile electronic warfare system. So Russia designed this to basically disrupt enemy communications, command and control, reconnaissance, etc. You know, the C4ISR stuff. And it's a relatively modern piece of equipment. And what happened is that they just kind of abandoned it in Ukraine, or at least one of them. So the Ukrainians captured it, and guess who they turned it over to? Yeah. So the United States now has a hold of it, and they're probably having fun picking it apart. Nice little pickup there for U.S. intelligence.
Huh.
Let's see. What else did we have here? Oh, there's an interesting app in Ukraine called E-Enemy. In Ukrainian, Bopor, Vorog. Not sure what the correct pronunciation is there. But basically, people are using that to report the locations of Russian soldiers to the Ukrainian government, as well as their equipment and where they're attacking and whatnot. So I thought that was pretty interesting, sort of a manifestation of modern digital warfare. Oh, did you hear about the Chernobyl thing?
I heard that there were soldiers who were getting radiation poisoning and stuff like that.
Yeah, they drove through the most irradiated part.
Yeah, for the thing that I read about that was that if you're just going through and you don't disturb the ground and the
Mhm.
wildlife and stuff, it's okay and it's pretty low amounts of radiation. But there's like a lot of very fine radiated particles that are just on stuff, and if you move them, then it goes into the air, and if it goes into people's lungs, it can be really bad. So the area is still quite dangerous. You can't just go traipsing about in Chernobyl and explore and expect to have a good time. So I think they may have just checked the radiation levels when they went in and been like, "Yep, seems good," and then they stomp and drive around, and people are getting really sick now.
Yeah,
So
they kicked up a bunch of dust when they drove through, and then the soldiers breathed in the dust, so now they have irradiated dust in their lungs. And results are exactly as you would predict. There were several dozen Russian soldiers that ended up hospitalized back in Belarus as a result. So perhaps an understandable mistake, but it just kind of fits into a larger pattern of bad planning on the part of the Russian military. Let's
yeah,
see.
chat's
Somebody,
also saying
oh,
that
go
they
on.
were told to dig stuff. And if you're digging in the dirt there, yeah, that's going to have a similar problem.
I heard about that, but I don't know that I ever saw it confirmed. Because there's a lot of stuff I see reported by the Kyiv Independent, which is the big newspaper in Ukraine, as well as stuff from the Ukrainian government and military. But all of that stuff kind of comes with an asterisk, because of course, being combatants in the war, they can't entirely uh, be honest about everything just because of operational security. And also, they have an incentive to try to sort of misrepresent events so that they're a little more favorable to Ukraine, as a result of them being in an existential crisis. Understandable. But as a result, some of the sources there are not entirely reliable. So I generally try to wait for third-party verification on that. So I don't remember exactly if that was verified by a third party or not, but I don't think it was. But yeah, I did hear that Russian soldiers not only drove through the Red Forest around Chernobyl, but also had to dig some trenches, which is, yeah, that
Not the
just says it
smartest
all.
idea of the year.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, they really shouldn't have been around Chernobyl to begin with. I mean, the only reason I can kind of understand it because it's like the shortest path between the northern part of the border and Kiev. So, okay, fine. But you didn't have to keep people there. It
This
just
is
doesn't
like
really
one of
make it.
those tragic tales of whenever you have the option between the short path and the long path, and the short path has some negative consequence attached to it. Would you like to go through Chernobyl and arrive at your destination in this time frame, but risk the radiation, or go around it and take longer but not get the
Mhm.
radiation?
Yeah. They took the short route. They don't have much to show for it, suffice to say. Let's see. So this next thing is something that a guy in chat was talking about last week a little bit. There was a video of some Ukrainian soldiers allegedly abusing some Russian POWs. They kind of had them on the ground and supposedly they had shot them in the leg. I don't think they actually showed them shooting them. Although, well, maybe they did at the end. I didn't see the whole video. But there was some debate about the veracity of the video. I think it was accurate. I mean, I don't think it was faked, basically, from what I saw of it. The POWs looked like basically prototypical Russian POWs. And generally, when you see Russian POWs in videos, they're just a little messed up. They have blood on their faces, they're dirty. Very much a POW look. So it looked like that. And they had the right colors on as well. The Russians have white armbands on, whereas the Ukrainians currently are using blue armbands. They used to have yellow, but apparently they switched over to blue for security reasons, or so I read. So it seems to be an accurate video. One of the things I saw in the comments under the video is that the captured Russians may have been artillerymen. And apparently a lot of the Ukrainian military really has it in for Russian artillerymen at this point on account of the shelling of the cities and whatnot. So it could be that's part of the reason there. Hello?
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My computer was acting funky there for a second. But yeah, that could be the reason why they were abusing the prisoners. But beyond that, yeah, it would qualify as a war crime if so. And I believe it was the Minister of Defense in Ukraine released a video, a short video, basically saying that yes, tensions are high for obvious reasons, but we all need to respect the Geneva Conventions. Don't abuse prisoners. Don't make videos of you soaking bullets in pig fat because you want to kill Chechens in the most humiliating way possible. That's obviously very insulting to the Muslim people who volunteer to fight with Ukraine. So, yeah, there's been some issues there in that regard. But the Ukrainian government has tried to address them. The Minister of Defense released that video, and then President Zelensky himself released a video discouraging soldiers. Well, not discouraging, but telling them not to do stuff like that. Yeah, there's going to be some ugliness here. It's not just going to be Russians committing abuses, although they seem to be committing most of them thus far. There's been some videos of Ukrainians doing some distasteful things as well.
Yep, kind of like protests and rioters. Wars are going to attract a certain kind of person to get involved with as well, and it's impossible to conduct yourself in a perfectly ethical way in war, whether you are the defender or the attacker.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's probably going to get worse. You know, did you see some of the stuff coming out of Irpin the past few days?
I don't think so.
And Irpin is that's town northwest of Kyiv, and there's been a lot of fighting there. It's been one of the major fronts, one of the major battle zones, I guess, in the conflict thus far. And of course, recently the Russians withdrew from that whole area, you know, the past couple days. And it looks like they were abusing some of the civilians. If not before, then at least in the past few days. You know, they found a basement full of civilian bodies that had signs of torture on them. And the road along Irpin was littered with, well, maybe not littered, but it had a number of dead civilian bodies that kind of suggested that they might have just arbitrarily shot them on the way out. Somebody was suggesting they may have just died as collateral damage in the fighting between Russians and Ukrainians. That's also possible. But Ukrainians on Reddit were saying otherwise. But yeah, there's been some mistreatment there that was happening, it looks like. Not entirely clear why. I'm not sure. Maybe they thought they were insurgents or something. Or maybe one guy was suggesting that they killed all of the males so between 18 and 60 in Irpin. I don't know if that's accurate. At least I haven't seen that confirmed by anybody. It seems like a needlessly brutal method. Most of the civilians had already evacuated anyway. I don't know how many were really left. But yeah, I don't think that's true, but it could be. I can't entirely rule it out either. I might add that one of the problems that the Russian army has that we talked about last week is that they don't have a lot of mid-level leadership, like non-commissioned officers and whatnot. Oh, I need to thank that guy, by the way. I'll get to that in a minute. But yeah, they don't have a lot of NCOs or mid-level officers. And one analyst on a Twitter thread was suggesting that one of the results of that is a lack of discipline by some of the rank-and-file infantry, because basically there's just not a lot of oversight of what they're doing. And because a lot of the infantry are really inexperienced, very young, etc., and very, you know, testosterone-laced on account of being in a war, it seems that they're committing more abuses than they would otherwise if they perhaps had more leadership on the ground. So it could be that's what's happening. It may not necessarily be a concerted effort by the Russian government to intimidate local populations through violence. It could just be some of the local soldiers venting. on local population. And it wouldn't be the first time in history that's happened. That's not unusual in war. Young hotheads often, murder or torture local civilians in wars where things aren't going well, or even just because they're psychopaths. Again, you need to have oversight over soldiers. As a soldier, you have an immense amount of discretion in a war. And if you don't make sure to have that discretion overseen by some kind of officer, then it's really easy for some of the bad actors in a military to get away with literal murder. Now that's again, that's me being kind of charitable. That's a charitable interpretation of events. It could be that they were just trying to intimidate the locals. I can't say for sure. But regardless, the point here is that it's going to create a lot of bad blood either way, or even worse bad blood. I mean, people in Ukraine are obviously already angry, but whenever they liberate a town or something, they hear the stories about what the Russians did while they were there, and very rarely is it positive news.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the thing with power in general, and in this case it's a monopoly on violence, is if you're going in and you're military personnel, you by default, by the virtue of being a professional military person, you have the monopoly on violence, which means you can more or less do what you want unless you have some scruples that would prevent you from doing this or that action, or you have someone above you who's telling you this is not allowed. But then typically the responsibility for whatever bad stuff happens during the wartime just falls to the country in general. Like, there are a lot of examples in history of the victors going in. Russia has a pretty bad reputation for what the Soviet soldiers, I guess it's a Soviet thing, but what the soldiers did in Germany whenever the war ended there.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's like a long-term consequence, I would say, rather than a short-term one for the soldiers. And it's not everybody either. That's another thing that you can hear of, like, stories from the Soviet soldiers who were there and they saw it happening and didn't really have the means to stop it if it was such a broad-based issue. War is pretty ugly.
Yep. 0 out of 10 stars. Do not recommend.
Would not try even once.
Well, that's the best way. That's the best approach, really. Unfortunately, as Leon Trotsky said, you may not be interested in war, but war is most certainly interested in you. So you still got to prepare for it.
Yeah, there's another quote. Those who don't fight with the sword can still die by one, or something like that.
Sounds right. I'm not familiar with the quote, but I get the gist of it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, going back to Chernobyl here, the forest in the Chernobyl exclusion zone caught fire. So there was about 10,000 hectares of forest that got caught on fire there. So, not saying it happened on purpose, but, if you can avoid setting the irradiated forest on fire, that would be super good.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't do that. Oh, here's a fun video. This is a Russian Orthodox priest in a church in Ukraine being thrown out because he started to, quote unquote, pray for Putin. And also he refused to pray for fallen Ukrainian warriors. So some of the locals didn't appreciate that, and they threw him out, as a result of which we have some video. There we go. Yeah, there's an interesting angle there about religion in Ukraine and Russia. The Russian Orthodox Church has kind of long been a de facto extension of the Russian government, even going all the way back to the czars, and all the more so now, basically. And oh, it didn't work. But the Ukrainian church has generally been kind of a subsidiary to the Moscow Patriarch. Basically, it's been like a subsidiary branch to the Russian Orthodox Church. And the Russians have kind of used that link to their benefit to try to exert what you might call cultural influence in Ukraine. There it is. And the Ukrainian government kind of cottoned on to that. specifically under, I think, President Zelensky. And so he actually uh, either negotiated or leaned on, depending who you talk to, on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to separate from the Moscow Church and form its own independent branch. I would add here that they're all still part of the overarching umbrella of Orthodox Christendom. Like I think, I don't know the right terminology, so I apologize. But basically, the Orthodox equivalent of the Vatican is still located in Istanbul, I believe. And so that's still sort of Orthodox headquarters for all of these different branches around the world. So what's happened is that, in effect, the Ukrainian church became a direct branch, directly subsidiary to the Istanbul church, rather than subsidiary to the Moscow church, which was itself directly subsidiary to the Istanbul church. And boy, did that result in some drama, because there was a lot of people in Ukraine who kind of resented that. You know, the pro-Russia population kind of felt like their culture was being diluted, and that this was the politicization of a religious institution, which should be kept out of politics. Although, you know, that was kind of a silly argument. It was already in politics, but that's how people felt anyway. So there was some consternation about that. And then also individual priests kind of divided as well. You know, some of them didn't want to do it, some did. There was a lot of variance there. And so this confrontation between Russia and Ukraine therefore has a religious manifestation. You know, there's this tension and divide between the Russia Orthodox Church and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And in general, more and more churches in Ukraine have been aligning with the Ukrainian church against the Russian Orthodox Church, just because of, you know, recent events in particular, but also the past 8 years as well, just in general of tension between the two. But there's still some priests in Ukraine that still align more with the Moscow Patriarchy, and as a result, they tend to be somewhat at odds with some of the Ukrainian nationalist population. As a result of which we have this video, you know, on Twitter.
Yeah, a lot of religious leaders will try to stay out of politics as much as possible, but there's always going to be some level of entanglement because the issues are connected. People who are religious are going to have some presence in politics, and they're going to have opinions and say stuff. So,
yeah. But it's just another angle to the war. It's just another front, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Oh, quick guide for you. Both sides use similar equipment, similar uniforms. One of the ways that they distinguish infantry from each other is through the armbands and leg bands. So at the beginning of the war, yellow meant Ukrainian army, and blue was volunteers. And then white was Russian army, and red was separatist army. Separatist refers to separatist from the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. And again, since then, the Ukrainian army has shifted away from the yellow, so now it's just all blue now. But when you see infantry in videos and stuff, that's how the colors break down. Let's see. Yeah, there was that. There was that.
Are you a Star Wars person at all?
Oh, I was. I was really into it when I was a kid, but you know, grad school kind of sucked the life out of me, so I wasn't able to keep track of it anymore. So I'm not like up to date on it.
You're talking about the armbands. It reminded me of the different lightsaber colors and what they mean.
Ah, yeah.
Did you ever play Knights of the Old Republic?
No, I used to watch you guys play it a little bit, but I never played it myself.
We played the online one, which also, it's in the same time frame as the single player games, but the games go into pretty good detail about what each of them mean. A blue lightsaber is a Jedi Guardian, and they tend to have a focus on melee combat. They're really good with the lightsaber and strong and aggressive and stuff. And then a green lightsaber is a Jedi Consular, and they're more of the Force user type, like Yoda, where they can push and pull stuff around. They'll fight with a lightsaber if they have to, but it's not their specialization. And then yellow is Jedi Sentinel, and they're typically good at a lot of different stuff. They're kind of like the jack of all trades more of a balanced sort of Jedi, which there aren't that many yellow lightsabers in the movies, but the armbands made me think of that.
Yeah, similar. Yeah, similar vibe there. Let's see. Do you remember the pregnant woman from Mariupol who was injured when the hospital got blown up?
I heard about that.
Her name was Mariana, I guess. I'm not sure what the Ukrainian pronunciation would be. But apparently, she was one of the refugees that was taken to Russia as a result of the Russians forcibly evacuating civilians from parts of Mariupol. And they actually forced her to make a video saying that the strike on the hospital was fake news, basically. So there are some concerns now for her safety since she kind of became one of the faces of Russian aggression, early on in the war. And now she's kind of stuck in enemy territory. So that'll be one of the little subplots to keep an eye on going forward. And the fun fact for you, Neuro, so the Russian military budget, and the annual Russian military budget, that is about $50 billion. And what I read online is, in contrast, one Ford-class aircraft carrier, which is the newest class of aircraft carrier the U.S. has been producing, the cost of producing one of those is about $37 billion. So a little over half of the entire annual budget for the Russian military.
I didn't see that particular comparison, but I did see one that was the U.S. military spending versus the Russian economy as a total.
Yeah.
The U.S. economy is insane.
It's quite large. It's quite large and has quite a long reach.
Yeah, and that was, I think, the main edge, going back in time to World War II. The main edge for the U.S. wasn't their immediate military strength. It was their ability to make trucks and a bunch of stuff from a very defensible location with the Pacific and an Atlantic Ocean on either side. So they didn't have to invest as much in immediate defense compared to, say, countries in mainland Europe against attacks. They got to focus on just making a ton of factories that make a lot of metals, components, and parts that are going to be used in a lot of these vehicles and that kind of a thing. So it powered up the industry side of stuff. Use a StarCraft example, you got to take a bunch of bases and research a bunch of tech and get really strong before you actually step into battle.
Exactly. Yeah, the miracle of production and Western logistics. That was a war winner there for the United States.
I think one of the the optics aspects of Russia and the perception of the Russian military is the landmass of Russia is so huge that if you're looking at the landmass of the US and of Russia, it's like, yeah, it's a 50-50. But the concentration of economic stuff that happens is a lot greater in the US. Population is higher. There's a lot more concentration of just wealth in the area.
Yeah, what would you call it? The economic geography of Russia is very different than the United States. The U.S. has vast concentrations of industry, especially in the Midwest and in the major metropolitan areas. And in addition to having those concentrations, they're located in areas like, New York has the Port of New York, for example. They're located along the coast and along major rivers that are navigable and don't freeze over, for most of the year. So that means that it's really easy to export and import stuff, vast quantities of stuff. It's still easier to ship bulk goods by ocean. Well, maybe not necessarily easier, but it's more cost effective to ship bulk goods by ocean than any other mode of transportation. And because the United States is sort of this island continent, where we have the West Coast and the East Coast, and then a vast network of rivers in the interior, we have a geography that's almost custom designed for easy transportation and logistics. And the fact that we built on top of that geography a whole political economy that was basically custom designed by merchants to serve merchants means that we're able to leverage those advantages to the hilt.
Mm-hmm.
So Russia, by contrast, is just like the opposite. They're just kind of stuck in the interior. Huge chunks of their land are covered over by tundra and permafrost. And we've kind of discussed before, it's really difficult to construct stuff on permafrost
Mm-hmm.
because the permafrost moves around, it melts and then freezes again, and it's very difficult to construct permanent structures on terrain like that. And so that makes it prohibitively expensive in many cases to build a lot of economic infrastructure, even in areas where there are even in areas that are wealthy in natural resources and whatnot. And so the lack of ports that are not frozen over most of the year and the lack of internal navigation just makes everything much more difficult. There are rivers in like Siberia, but almost all of them drain. That is to say, there are a lot of major rivers in Siberia, but almost all of them drain into the Arctic Ocean, which is not a useful ocean for a river to drain into. You want them to drain into like the Mediterranean or the Pacific Ocean, the river, bodies of water like that you can actually conduct trade across. You can conduct some trade from Arctic ports, but there are problems with ice during certain times of year, and just again, the permafrost issue complicates things. So if you're Russia, you've basically just got like these little windows, logistical geographic windows through which you interact with the world. Vladivostok out on the Pacific Ocean, St. Petersburg in the Baltic Sea, Krasnodar and Rostov over in the Black Sea. Those are sort of your entry points there. And then everything that goes in or out of those ports ends up having to be transported along this massive rail network. I don't think I've mentioned this before, but one of the things I learned about the Russian military over the past month is that their logistical system is heavily dependent on rail transportation. Like it's very much focused on shipping weapons, vehicles, supplies, and whatnot by rail. So anything that's close to a railhead, the Russians can generally supply sufficiently. But the further away from railheads they get, the more trouble they have, and we've seen what trouble looks like for them in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the kind of problem that they have once they get away from their rail network. But within their rail network, things generally operate better. They actually invest a lot of money in their rail network. They even have rail troops. They have like a whole rail command basically that has its own troops and command structure specifically to manage it. There was even some video of an armored car that they were sending over to Ukraine at one point. I didn't even know they still had them, but armored cars used to be a big part of warfare in the early 20th century, at least in Eastern Europe and the Russian Civil War. So it was kind of a throwback to see one. But yeah, that just illustrates, how important rail is to the Russian military and to Russian logistics. And another example here of how important rail is to Russian logistics. When Russia expanded into Siberia originally, they actually expanded by way of the Arctic. They had a lot of trade with Europe conducted through the ports of Arkhangelsk, Murmansk. St. Petersburg didn't exist in the 1600s, but they did have other northern ports up there. And so they traded a lot of furs and stuff. And so that northern area there was actually one of the most economically important regions of Russia for a long time, in sort of late Middle Age Europe, and late Middle Age Russia. And what happened is that Russian fur traders would sail along the Arctic coast of northern Russia, or what would become northern Russia, and then they would find the mouths of rivers and then basically sail up them, and then by sailing up those rivers they would penetrate south into Siberia, and that's pretty much how they settled almost all of it, and how they got all of it. So it wasn't actually Russians moving east along the land route, like you might intuitively think, like I had intuitively thought for a long time. It was actually Russians moving south from the Arctic coast into the interior. And it wasn't until like 1900, like around there, that they finished construction of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which was constructed along the southern reaches of Siberia, that those southern regions started to get really populated. Before that, those were just too far away, because if you wanted to travel through them, you had to travel for like a year by wagon and whatnot across the land route. But once the rail was completed, it was much more accessible. And it was at that point that people started flooding into Siberia and populating it for not the first time, but for the first time in any great numbers. So that rail line that runs through Siberia, specifically South Siberia, is the most important economic asset for that region. You know, everything they make there that gets exported has to go through that line. All of the supplies they get from other parts of Russia and the outside world, all of that comes through that line. I guess some stuff comes by air too, but rail is going to be the more important element there. So just rail is immensely important logistically for Russia. But to bring this full circle, that's also a problem because again, the most economically efficient way to move bulk goods is by water. And rail is also very cost effective, but it can't beat, oceanic trade. So those interior regions of Russia, for all of their material wealth, well, maybe not material wealth, but natural resource wealth, let's say, they still haven't been able to benefit from it completely because it's just so expensive to get it out. And that's one of the reasons that Eurasianism is a little bit bullshit. You know, there's sort of this historical idea of the world island. This is an old geopolitical idea from like the late 19th century. And the idea is that whoever controls the Eurasian world island will control the world because they're going to have access to all these huge markets in Europe and China, and Europe and China will be able to trade together. And if you control Eurasia, you'll be able to control that trade and sell all of these commodities to these different producers, and you'll just be the global superpower for sure. And it's never happened, and it probably never will happen because the reality is that coastal trade still trumps land trade, like easily. So those concentrations of wealth and economic activity in China and in Europe are no accident. You know, those are the areas that have the most access to seaborne trade, and in turn, that's where the wealth gets concentrated.
I'm
So even it, go ahead.
I'm thinking of a physics explanation for this because you're saying coastal trade beats land trade, and the physics explanation that comes to mind is friction. Because with rail, you're
Yeah,
still trying to reduce the friction by having rail lines instead of wheels that have to slog along. If you have a boat, as long as it has some forward momentum and you're pushing behind it, it slips over the water instead of needs to beat against the ground or rub against something. It's a theory.
no, that's a good theory. That's a good way of looking at it. You know, the harder it is to move goods physically, the more friction there is,
Yeah,
and in
also,
turn,
Chad is also saying that roads only go to one place, but the water is a big body and you could pretty much go wherever.
yeah, yeah, it's a wide open sea. You can go wherever the goods need to go. Roads, in contrast, have to be constructed. They have to be maintained. They're costly. They can pay for themselves depending on where they're located, what they're connecting, and whatnot. But the friction there, so to speak, to use your analogy, is always going to be greater than if you just use waterborne trade or riverborne trade, for that matter. Russia does benefit from riverborne trade. They do have the Volga River, and it's no accident that a lot of economic activity happens along that. It's just a lot cheaper to move stuff up and down the river than it is across land. So a lot of Russia's automotive sector, for example, is actually located along the northern Volga. That's like Samara and whatnot. Those cities up there.
Oh,
You
also,
know,
another useful function of water is that it's locally flat, so you don't have to go uphill or downhill.
yeah, another good example. Lots of energy preservation going on with seaborne trade, so to speak. The
And
United States,
we
go
invest
ahead.
so heavily in it that it's probably the main contributor to, actually, one of the major ones for human caused climate change is the huge engines on these massive boats that are cranking tons of CO2 and burning a lot of fossil fuels. But it's a really important component of our trade currently.
Yeah, yeah, that's kind of a sticking point. But to give you like an analogy in the United States, Detroit is the historical center anyway of the automotive sector in the United States. And it was specifically chosen for that role because it was along the Great Lakes, because you can load up all of the commodities that you need very efficiently by using barges and ships on the Great Lakes to move bulk goods as needed. and there's a whole series of canals and stuff connecting all of the different Great Lakes with each other. So it's a pretty expansive network. And back in the what was I think it was like the 1950s or 60s that Canada built the St. Lawrence Seaway, which was a massive infrastructure project to allow ships to travel from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean through the St. Lawrence River, which had not been possible before because there was a whole series of rapids along the river. So they had to create canals and stuff to kind of circumvent those, but they eventually did. So it's all just very, very efficient, economically speaking. Very impressive work there as far as building a broader network that makes economic activity as smoothless as possible. Fun side trivia there, they actually had to block off the river that feeds the Niagara Falls while they were doing that. I believe that's the case. So for a while, the Niagara Falls didn't have any water flowing over it. They also had to drain, well, they also had to block off the river in other parts. They actually got to see the seabed, and they actually found a bunch of like old sunken ships from the 1600s and 1700s and stuff. It was pretty cool. We doing okay on time?
Yep, we're at about 2 hours 20. You had 3 hours of sleep too, and I'm a very health first person, so if you wanted to have a shorter one for the purpose of resting, I would be supportive of that decision, but if you want to go for the full three, we can.
I'm feeling okay. I got my second wind. I think I
Nice.
can push through.
The chat appreciates you. I
Thank
did
you.
get a update slash question about the Solomon Islands in China from Alleluia.
Oh, that's right. Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, he was saying it's the first time China has had the ability to extend their reach down to the Australia New Zealand sphere of influence, and it puts a Chinese base within 2,000 kilometers of the Australian coast. He just wanted to update us on that, I guess, and see if you had any thoughts or if you had read anything.
I do, but I wanted to. There's somebody I wanted to thank. There was a guy in chat last time when we were talking about non-commissioned officers who listed all of the different formations in the US Army and then listed all of the different ranks for the officers and NCOs.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to thank him for making that effort because that was actually really cool. I actually wrote down all of that and made a little notepad file. So
Nice.
very cool contribution from him. Much appreciated. I wanted to have his screen name here, but I can't figure out what the hell I did with it. Well, if he's here, he knows who he is. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Um, yeah, so the Solomon Islands. So the thing with that is that it's not actually going to result in the construction of a Chinese base. When I was reading about it, I was trying to look for the details of the agreement. And basically, my impression is that the Solomon Islands government is basically using China as a stalking horse to try to extract concessions from Australia. And when I say concessions, I mean probably investment money transfers and probably more military support. Keep in mind that in spite of this agreement, Australia actually not only has existing agreements of their own with the Solomon Islands, they actually have troops in the Solomon Islands. There was a lot of unrest recently in the Solomon Islands as a result of ethnic tension and some separatist tension as well, I believe. And the Solomons government asked for and received Australian troops to help suppress the violence. So links with Australia are still strong. It's not as though they're being pushed out of the Solomon Islands. The agreement in question entails basically two things. One, if the Solomon Islands requests military support from China, China has agreed to provide it. That's one item. Second item is that the Chinese Navy will be allowed to call on ports in the Solomon Islands. That might not be the right phrasing. I don't have a naval background, but
What does it
uh,
mean?
ba basically it means that naval ships can visit ports in the Solomon Islands without issue.
Hmm.
So it's normal for warships to make ports of call in different ports around the world. The U.S. Navy used to, pop by Hong Kong. Even after the transfer to China, sometimes they would just kind of swing by.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. It's more symbolic, an agreement, than anything. The agreement does not entail any allowance of the permanent basing or stationing even of Chinese troops in the Solomon Islands. And there is no agreement to construct any kind of naval base. Uh, it's basically just purely a security agreement in which China agrees to help Solomon's Islands if requested to. So that's a relatively weak security agreement in the grand scheme of things, but it is significant in so much as it's the first such agreement that China has signed in the South Pacific, which, as the poster mentioned, is well within Australia's little sphere of influence.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's definitely a big deal strategically, and Australia is going to have to respond to that. But I think that they will, and I suspect that the Solomon Islands is not trying to signal here that it wants to just break away, from Australia. And in fact, I think I remember a Solomon's rep saying, they were just trying to diversify their security relationship, which is basically the diplomatic, passive aggressive way of saying that you're going to play one power off of another. So they're going to try to get as many resources as they can from China and Australia by trying to play off of their respective anxieties.
Yeah, or try to be friends with both sides and not really pick a side.
Exactly. Yeah, so I wouldn't read too much into it. The Australian government is going to do something for sure, but I don't think it'll be too dramatic. I think this can be managed with finesse, such that it doesn't result in, any kind of strategic realignment in the region where, the Solomons is firmly in the Chinese camp and there's a military buildup in the South Pacific. I don't think that's in the cards, at least not given what I've read thus far. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. Let's see. So while he's gone, I guess while he's gone, I'll make a quick point here about Bandera. Not the band Pandera, but Bandera. So there was a guy named Bandera. I think his first name was Derek. I'm going to look it up here. Stepan Bandera. So Stepan Bandera was a Ukrainian separatist, and he was something of a fascist. And he collaborated, I should say, with the Nazis when they invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. As a result of which, Stepan Bandera has a rather negative reputation, not only in Russia, but also in former Soviet republics, up to and including, to a degree, Ukraine. Now, after World War II ended, for about 10 years, there was what would you call it, an insurgency, to use modern parlance. To use more traditional parlance, there was a guerrilla war in Ukraine after the end of World War II for about 10 years, waged by Ukrainian nationalists against the Soviet government. And the Soviets were able to put them down by around the mid-50s. But one of the ways that they tried to discredit Ukrainian nationalists, and perhaps it was, legitimate, is by accusing them of being fascists. Certainly a lot of them have been collaborators, so, that was a big knock in and of itself. But a lot of them were actually fascists. And they called them banderas or banderistas or whatever the Russian for that is. And that's significant because that feeds into the current perception of the conflict in Ukraine within Russia. Because one of the ways that, of course, Russia has tried to frame the conflict is by an operation to denazify Ukraine. And that's a reference to the Russian assertion in 2014 that Euromaidan was nothing but a CIA coup plot to overthrow the government and replace it with a pro-Western neo-Nazi government. So that sounds really weird from a Western perspective, almost non sequitur, and it seems especially ridiculous now, given that Ukraine has a Jewish president and whatnot. But from a Russian perspective, it actually makes a lot more sense, and I think that's kind of been lost in translation a little bit as people in the West have tried to understand the Russian perspective on this. In Russian culture and in Russian history, the idea of fascist Ukrainian nationalists, such as Stepan Bandera, and kind of under his leadership, has substantive precedent. They did collaborate with the Nazis, and there was the nationalist revolt in the 50s. And so that is a cultural touchstone there for Russians that they're all familiar with. They're all familiar with the sort of the evil fascist nationalist collaborators out west in Ukraine. And people in Ukraine themselves are kind of familiar with the narrative, although it's kind of been discredited, since the end of the Soviet Union, as a Soviet actions of one kind or another have kind of come increasingly to light. But that said, the reason that Russian propaganda about Euromaidan being a Nazi coup plot had so much traction in Russian culture is because there was already kind of some suspicion that there was Ukrainian nationalists who still sympathized with the neo-Nazi collaborators, especially in the western part of Ukraine. It's kind of always been well known, even during the Soviet era, that Western Ukraine was sort of a bastion of Ukrainian nationalism. So the idea that those people might still have some residual Bandera neo-Nazis among their number, that was something that a lot of Russians were very ready to believe in 2014 and now, for that matter. And it's specifically because they were ready to believe it that the Russian government crafted that narrative about Nazis. Obviously, there were Nazis there. There was like the Azov battalion and whatnot, but again, as we've talked about before, it was blown way out of proportion. And the reason they blew it out of proportion is specifically because it was such an effective narrative that fed into that old historical story about Soviet patriots versus Nazi collaborator nationalists. So that's the genesis of that narrative there. And hopefully that kind of explains where that narrative came from and why it's so prominent, especially amongst the Russian community there.
Yeah, if history has taught us anything, it's that you can motivate people quite a lot if you're playing to their already existing prejudice.
Yeah.
Rather than trying to sell them a new thing. It's like, they already had suspicion of this group, or they viewed this group as worse, and then if you really push hard that, oh yeah, they're the baddies and they're worse than you think, then they're very ready to just like get on board with that, as opposed to just picking some random group that maybe hasn't been historically looked at negatively or didn't have some historical event attached to it and being like, yeah, they're the bad ones. It's harder to sell.
Exactly. That's the real art of propaganda. You don't tell people what to believe. You tell them what they want to hear.
Mm-hmm.
That's the most effective way. So Russian nationalists were very ready to hear about, resurgent Ukrainian fascist nationalism in this neighboring country that used to be in their sphere of influence but has been trying to drift away. It's all just too convenient for them. Mm-hmm. It just fits into the worldview as Russia as an anti-fascist global power trying to protect itself from nefarious Westerners. Mm-hmm. It's easy to believe, and so it has a lot of traction out there. Not making excuses for the West, we've made mistakes vis-a-vis Ukraine, but the whole Nazi thing is just bullshit and was from the start.
I did read, or I think I was watching a documentary about South America, and there was a United Fruit Company that was like, he already knows, they were fucking with stuff and basically being as capitalist and oppressive as possible, of going into areas and getting super cheap labor and treating the locals like shit, and basically sort of using them as slave labor in the sense that you do give them a job, but it pays less than what it costs for them to live in, that kind of a thing. So yeah, they're basically indentured servants at that point. And the US has had a lot of this Monroe Doctrine stuff of, we want to decide who leads whatever country based on how favorable they are to us. And there was some particular leader, I think it was of Guatemala, who was like actually favorable to Nazis and stuff, but the US was backing him because he was allowing these fruit companies and stuff to do whatever they wanted to, and also just seemed to be the more stable choice. But because he was so loud with the pro-Nazi stuff, they ended up choosing to favor someone else. But yeah, that's definitely something that we have blood on our hands for, and sins and that kind of thing. It's just wanting to intervene in other countries and decide who gets to lead based on how favorable they are to our government. But then just the general corruption, and when we're talking about the corruption in the Russian military, it made me think of some of this stuff with the CIA, where if you're a CIA person and you have a way to talk to the higher ups in the US government and you're friends with them, you can be like, hey, I've got this problem here in South America. There's this group of people they're going to be communists soon if we don't do something about this. And they're like, oh my gosh, communists? Well, send in the whole army or do some really drastic measure here to shift the balance of power away from communism, but you're taking it at this word of this the random person who's talking to you, who maybe has done some favors for you. And that reminded me of the quote that you said where every government has some level of corruption. It's about trying to manage that corruption and shift the norms away from corruption being okay. And that's how you have a better functioning governance.
Yeah. That's the way to do it. You're never going to get rid of it completely, but you can make it relatively difficult and you can shift the norms.
Yeah, corruption only really benefits people in the short term who are in on the scam, whatever it is. Big picture wise, if the Russian military is corrupt and people who were supposed to update and fix up the tanks, they use that money for personal gain, then you've got shitty tanks.
Oh, yeah. Did I tell you about the cardboard reactive armor?
No.
Have you ever heard of explosive reactive armor?
Not really, but I can guess by the words.
Yeah, it's kind of self-descriptive. You know, basically the idea is that you put these explosive modules around the tank, and if they get hit by by a tank round or whatever, they're designed to set off an explosive that is sort of focused outward in the direction where the shell is coming from. And the idea is that the explosive force dissipates the energy of the incoming round enough to prevent it from doing substantive damage to the tank. That's not an expert's description. I'm sure anybody who actually knows how it works is rolling their eyes right now, but that's my understanding. That's like that's the layman's explanation. So there was a captured Russian tank that the Ukrainians have, and they actually noticed that the explosive reactive armor modules were full of cardboard. Incredible. Like, the level of corruption is just so deep in the Russian military as an institution. Like, it just manifests in 1,000 different ways. It's amazing.
I was telling my parents a little bit on the phone, just giving an example of if you're working in some government department and corruption is a mainstay of your field, and someone says, hey, we need you to fix the tanks. Here's $10 million. Your job is to go fix all those tanks over there. And you're like, okay. If you are corrupt, you can say, oh my gosh, I just received $10 million. Let's go to the heckin' resorts. Let's get a boat. Let's do this and this. And you can do a lot of crazy and fun stuff with that money. But whenever those tanks are rolled out and they're falling apart, they may look to you and say, what the fuck? What happened here?
That's what's happened. Yeah, there was one guy who allegedly committed suicide because his formation was revealed to have been just, riddled with corruption, and that he was either directly responsible or at least complicit in for allowing it. Yeah, there's a lot of people who have had their careers upended, suffice to say. So long as the Russian military didn't actually have to do anything, it was easy to hide. But all of a sudden, Russian government decided it needed to do something. It's probably even worse because it was such a snap decision. Like, we've talked before about how the Russian government narrowed the decision making to just like a few people at the very top of the government. Like, as far as planning the war, it was just a few people and they didn't tell anybody. So even people in the Russian army didn't really know that they were about to go to war. So as a result, another additional downside to that from the perspective of Russian officers is that they didn't have time to cover up their corruption. They were just blindsided, and so it's become just blindingly obvious all the different ways in which they were abusing their position to enrich themselves.
Yeah, if they knew that there was an upcoming conflict which was going to involve whatever units that they're doing the corrupt stuff with, they would be like, all right, we got to cut it back for a little bit and take this seriously. But once we're done, let's just like do some corrupt shit again. Okay, sounds good.
That's the plan.
Yeah,
almost certainly. I'm sure they're just hoping this whole thing goes away sooner rather than later. I mean, other than the obvious desire to end the violence anyway. Getting back to business as usual is probably a priority. Well, by the way, do you know that United Fruit Company is still around?
Yeah, it's the Chiquita banana lady, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Still selling that blood-tainted fruit. Although I don't think they're as bad as they used to be. And they certainly don't have nearly so much of influence with the U.S. government as they used to.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, who cares about fruit? You know, if you're working at the State Department and a fruit company says, "Hey, I need you to overthrow a government for me," like, are you really going to say yes? You're probably just going to roll your eyes.
It
Like,
depends
whatever,
on how
dude.
much you like bananas.
But not as good as they used to be, though. What was it? The Big Mike's, the Gross Michael bananas were like really good, from what I've heard.
Oh yeah, the flavor of banana candy is closer to the flavor of that banana, which used to be more popular. And we have a different
Yeah.
banana now, which is why your banana candy tastes different than your fruit bananas.
Yeah, the Gross Michael banana was almost creamy. It would almost melt in your mouth. It was really soft and it had really just attractive flavor, an attractive combination of flavor and texture. But there was the big fungal outbreak, Panama disease, and then after that, the crop was not wiped out completely. It just became, it got to the point where so much of the crop was lost every harvest that it was no longer economically viable.
Hmm.
So they had to replace it with something that was immune to Panama disease. And that's where we get the Cavendish banana, which is the type of banana that, you, me, and everybody our age all kind of grew up with.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's okay, it's serviceable, but it's very utilitarian as bananas go.
It's a
You know,
utility banana. You've got the
yeah,
actual delicious bananas of the olden times, but those were wiped out by the plague. Now we have
yeah,
utility bananas, which are disease resistant.
yeah.
Yeah, the
Well,
thing with this artificial selection and breeding particular fruits and stuff is if you're really going for some particular characteristics and you're making them all the same, then if there is a disease, it's going to ravage a huge amount of them. Some people were saying that this Cavendish banana is also potentially at risk for some stuff down the road just because they're all clones of each other. So if
mm,
something gets one of them, it pretty much gets all of them. But there are other types of bananas, so any banana enjoyers out there, you can only be so worried because we may just need to shift to the world's next banana.
actually, that's happening because there was a new outbreak a couple years ago that was affecting the Cavendish, and they were saying that they're probably going to have to shift to something new again. So we're going to have it happen again here. We're going to have hopefully something better than the Cavendish. I know some people like it, but it's just never been my thing.
Agent Smith, April 3rd, bashing the Cavendish banana. News at 11.
Yeah, I you know, I I live with my grandparents, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, my grandmother anyway. So, I've had a lot of opportunities to talk with them
Mm-hmm.
about, how they grew up and whatnot. And one of the topics that came up at one point was, bananas. And I asked them because I was curious, you've had the Gross Michael before. How was it? And they said, actually, it was really good. And I went online and like did some reading and stuff, and that's generally the impression. Like everybody's who's had them, or who had them back in the day, generally had just very positive reviews. So, Neuro, we've been cheated. We've been cheated by history. That was a really, really good banana that we missed out on there. And as a postscript here, I'll point out again that Gross Michaels still exists. People still grow them and they still sell them. They're still out there. They're just not viable economically as like a major crop. So you don't see them in your grocery store, like here in Dallas or New York or whatever. But you can get them. In fact, you can order them. I thought about ordering them by mail for one time because I was really wanting to try one just for the sake of trying it, but shipping was a bit expensive. It's a little bit pricey because they only grow them in like a few places, and the people who grow them generally grow them as like a hobby or something.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that there's a lot of commercial growers left. But yeah, they're in like Southeast Asia, South Asia. They're not uncommon there, places like that. So you can definitely still try them if you're interested. So if any of you guys are traveling abroad in a tropical region where they grow lots of bananas, try to find a Gross Michael and give it a try and give us a review because, apparently they're just like god tier bananas according to everybody who's tried them.
I'm kind of surprised because I like bananas. I think it's a good fruit. I enjoy banana, and apparently I've been having subpar bananas this whole time.
Well, when it comes to health food, people's expectations are never that high.
True. If you want unhealthy food, it's going to be maximum delicious, not sacrificing any other stats but deliciousness. But if you want healthy food, you've got to give up some of that deliciousness for the nutrients.
You gotta eat your Soylon Green oat bran stuff.
I don't eat that, but I do have oatmeal for breakfast every morning, and I have almost no sugar in my diet, aside from
Oh,
like
really?
sugars and fruits.
Congratulations. That's hard to do if you've been eating lots of sugary stuff.
Yeah, actually credit to Kukyo for that one, because he had diabetes and he just physically couldn't. So we would go like grocery shopping and stuff, and it didn't really make sense to be like, okay, well, I'm going to get a bunch of like sugary stuff and then you get stuff that's not sugary. It's just like, well, I'll try what you have to have, because when you see someone get diagnosed with diabetes and stuff and they have to cut some of what they used to enjoy, it can feel kind of lonely and isolating. So it was like, you know what, I'll try this gross yogurt thing with you too and see if it's any good. And some of the stuff is actually not too bad. And I just started developing more eating habits that way, where he was saying I can't eat or I can't have fruit juice anymore because it's a liquid payload of sugar, but you can have fruit. And I was like, oh, that's a really good thing to know. Even if you don't have diabetes, it's easier on your body to eat a fresh fruit, which is bonded to fiber, than to have a fruity drink. So pretty useful stuff. And then I just gradually got out of the habit of it, so I no longer crave sweets anymore. I know some people are like, they see a cake advertisement or ice cream, they're like, oh man, I need ice cream. That just doesn't happen to me anymore.
That makes it easy, man. That's the way to do it.
Yep.
Yeah, what is it I read? Sugar is supposed to be as addictive as heroin, something like that.
It's very addictive. It's totally crucial for your survival too, and the context of it is hunter-gatherer creatures that have limited options for food. So if you find something that's sweet, that means that you won't die for the day. So if you have a reward pathway that's activated where your body feels good because you had some sugar, then, well, that's great, because then you know what to seek out. But the problem is now we have, sometimes for your average person, an overabundance of availability of sugar, but you don't have great diminishing returns on your reward pathway activation. So you still feel really, really good having a soda, even if you don't actually need that soda to live.
I have a great deal of first-hand experience verifying that.
We have an expert here on the case.
Unfortunately so. Okay. What else did we have here? I don't think I mentioned like the rail war in Belarus, did I?
You talked about some Russian military that were like rail military.
This is different. So in Belarus, a lot of Russian troops are coming in.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the principal entry points for to get in. Well, it was one of the principal entry points to get into Ukraine as far as the northern front was concerned. So one of the things I've been reading a little bit about here and there is that people in Belarus are actually sabotaging the Belarusian rail network.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a whole lot of evidence because, the country's totalitarian and opaque. So, we have to take like little stories here and there, little bits of evidence. But apparently there has been a number of acts of sabotage to the point where the government rounded up some people and just like publicly accused them of being saboteurs, and we're going to punish them. Mm-hmm. Basically trying to make an example of them. So that suggests that there's been at least some shenanigans. There has been some effort by the Belarusian people and Belarusian people working on the railroads in Belarus to try to inhibit the flow of Russian material and weapons and whatnot into Ukraine by trying to, well, again, sabotage the Belarusian rail network. So I thought that was pretty interesting. You haven't heard much about Belarus too much in the conflict thus far, but Belarusian people are apparently doing what little they can to help Ukraine. So more power to them.
Yeah, I was reading some stuff about the leader of Belarus not being quite as keen to jump into the fray. It looked like Belarus was just going to march in with Russia side by side at the start of the conflict, but he doesn't have as firm of a grasp of power as Putin does over Russia. So I think he has to tread more carefully also in terms of sanctions. So Belarus is more reliant on other countries, as it's a smaller country than Russia, so they weren't quite as willing to risk eating those sanctions either.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And there's also allegations that the Belarusian military is very resistant to the idea of being deployed. So apparently there's some concern on the part of the government that if they tell them to go in, that they'll just turn around and maybe turn on the government. So that's apparently also kept the Belarusian army in barracks. Occasionally you hear about Belarusian troops being mobilized and moving around the country, maybe moving towards the border, something threatening like that, but I haven't yet seen them actually do anything. So it seems like they're going to sit this one out. That's actually been pretty common among Russia's allies. It's kind of interesting. They asked the Kazakhstan government for military forces to help them, and the Kazakh government said, no, we're not doing that. Probably for the same reason as Belarus, wanting to avoid sanctions and institutional resistance. But Kazakhstan is a pretty significant Russian ally, so the fact that they said no is pretty interesting. It's a pretty substantive sign of how much resistance there is, even among close Russian allies, to the war in Ukraine. Oh, and there's been a little fun around Armenia. The Azeris have been clashing with some of the Armenian military around the ceasefire line. I don't know how many people followed the Karabakh War. Well, the Second Karabakh War, as it's come to be called, that was fought in, I want to say 2020, between Azerbaijan and Armenia over disputed territory called Karabakh, or Artak, if you're Armenian. I think it's Artak anyway. And the Azeris were able to seize most of that territory, but not all of it. Some of it was left in the hands of Armenians. And that's pretty much where the conflict was frozen again, after a peace deal negotiated by the Russians. But the Russians have been withdrawing some of their forces from the Caucasus for obvious reasons. They're being redirected to Ukraine. And it seems the Azerbaijan government is sensing some opportunity here. So they've been applying some pressure to some Armenian units along the ceasefire line, and it's possible they could push through the ceasefire line and restart the war again and take what's left of Karabakh that they hadn't taken before in the earlier phase of the war. So that's another flashpoint to keep an eye on. That and the Kuril Islands are kind of the main ones thus far. But there's also an outside possibility that Georgia will invade the south. No, not the south. That Georgia will invade South Ossetia and possibly Abkhazia, the two separatist republics that they fought with Russia over in 2008. Right now, the government is led, that is to say, the government in Georgia is led by a relatively pro-Russian politician. He's kind of a pro-Russian oligarch guy. I think his name is Ivanishvili. But there's a lot of consternation within Georgia amongst the people, such that there have been mass protests in Georgia over the government's response to the war in Ukraine. They haven't come out and supported Russia, but they've also not come out explicitly in support of Ukraine. And the government actually tried to stop a plane from Ukraine from landing that was coming to Georgia in order to pick up Georgian volunteers who wanted to go to Ukraine to fight. That in particular upset a lot of people. So I don't think that the government is going to change over this. I don't think it's going to be so unpopular or so vulnerable to mass protests. But at the same time, if the war continues and if the government does something else that just agitates the shit out of people, it's possible that people could pressure the government into stepping down or some such. They have a presidential system, not a parliamentary system, so that would be much harder in Georgia than in other countries. But if things get bad enough, it's possible that the president could step down, and you could see a more pro-Ukrainian government step in, and that's when things would get interesting, because that's when there would be possibly sufficient public support for a renewed military effort to retake those two separatist republics. And that's a big deal because both of them are technically Russian protectorates, but the Russian military obviously is more than a little distracted right now, so it's not entirely clear they would be able to do much in response. I don't think the Georgian military has quite modernized and professionalized like the Ukrainian army has over the past 10 years. They'd been doing that before 2008, I think in like the 5 to 10 years leading up to the 2008 war, but I don't think they've been doing it as much since then. I kind of feel like the relationship with the West has kind of cooled a little bit since then due to the lack of Western intervention in the 2008 war. So I don't know what the status of the Georgian army is or how capable they would be in trying to take those two territories back. But certainly there's some public support for that. So that's another flashpoint to kind of keep your eye on. So that's Georgia, Azerbaijan, Kuril Islands, and maybe Moldova. Probably not Moldova. I don't think the Moldovan army is even remotely capable enough for that. But let's see. One of the interesting things that happened with the two Georgian separatist republics is that I think both of them, at least South Ossetia did, but I think also the other one, announced that they were going to hold a referendum on annexation to Russia. And that could just show anxiety on the part of the local elites there about, a potential lack of Russian protection due to the war in Ukraine. They may be pushing just to be formally part of Russia so they can be so that they can get that security umbrella that Russian oblasts get. That's obviously going to be much stronger than what separatist republics get. So we'll see if that goes anywhere. I don't know if Russia would even accept them in, even if they did pass a referendum like that. But certainly that shows the degree of anxiety on the part of local Russian allies there. Oh, what else did we get? We're probably, you're not waiting. Yeah, you're waiting. Okay. That's pretty much all I had. There was some other stuff about, did you hear about the poisoning in the peace talks?
Yes. I think they were trying to have some peace talks and a diplomat was attempted to be poisoned or something like that.
It actually wasn't even a diplomat. It was a Russian oligarch, Roman Abramovich. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing his name, but yeah, he's an oligarch. He was representing Russia in the peace talks in Istanbul, and he was poisoned with what is suspected to be some kind of nerve agent. He lost sight in his eyes and was numb and had a lot of, what was it, like abdominal pain or some such. So the suspicion is that he was poisoned with the same kinds of agents that Russia has been using in Europe for the past 10 years or so. The big question is why? What's the point of it? And it's not entirely clear why Russia would poison their own rep at the peace talks. I don't think the Ukrainians would do it. So I think the suspicion is at this point that there are different factions within Russia that are competing with each other over what Russia's position should be in the peace talks. So the one account I read is that one theory that I read online is that Roman Abramovich is a part of the dovish wing of the Russian government, and that he's pushing more for a reconciliation, a more conciliatory agreement with Ukraine. Whereas there are probably other people in the Russian government who are more hawkish, who really hate that. And it seems that they have been willing to go far enough to try to poison one of the leading doves in the Russian government in order to try to send a signal that they're opposed to any kind of conciliatory peace agreement at this stage. I would point out here that oh shit, what was it? It was just in my head.
I had a initial reaction of like, oh my gosh, the Russian oligarch was poisoned. Did Ukraine do it? But if he's looking for an outcome that would make Ukraine look better, then I could see Russia taking issue with that and wanting to slap at him.
Yeah, and I would, just quickly here, this is all speculation. This is all highly speculative. We really don't know who poisoned him or why. For all we know, it's rogue members of the FSB just being assholes. It's anybody's guess. It's wide open. Such is life in, post-Soviet Europe. Oh yeah, that's the point I was going to make. The dosage of poison that was given to Abramovich was not sufficient to kill him. And what I read, the theory I read is that that was probably on purpose. They were probably not trying explicitly to kill him, but rather just to send a message. They poisoned him just enough to make him sick, but not to kill him. So that's another factor to keep in mind. There's some signaling going on in prototypically dramatic Russian style.
Yeah, there does seem to be too the decision for what level of political opponent you allow to exist under you. And then this guy, if they poisoned him to hurt him but not kill him, he's apparently close enough that they feel like he can be a sort of critic of the government while still being beholden to it, rather than someone like Navalny, where he gets the you go to jail kind of treatment. Whereas this guy can still go meet with people and stuff, but he's been too friendly and now he gets poisoned.
Yeah. But again, it's just Russia's politics are so opaque at that top level, it's hard to judge. So,
Yeah.
the best we can do is old school Kremlinology, trying to read the tea leaves, little signals here and there to try to make inferences, to draw as best a picture as we can. Back to the past, as it were,
Mm-hmm.
in that and in so many other ways lately. But yeah, I guess that's all I've got. Before we go, I wanted to say hello to Dagnip, who I've been emailing with. I've been looking at your, I'm still looking through your latest email. You sent a lot of stuff, but I'll send you those questions shortly. I'm going to get on top of that and try to be better on emailing in future. And who else? There was also Mass. Is Mass Neotech here?
Yeah, he was
I think
around
we,
today.
yeah, I thought I saw him earlier in chat, but if he's still here, we can, if he has time, we can chat later after we're done here, and then we can get into that question he sent on Twitter because I've got some answers for him if he's still interested.
Dagnip says hi.
Hello. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate your support. It's cool to have a primary source down in Argentina. I'm really looking forward to trying to learn more about the country. Oh no, I don't mind the long emails at all.
Yeah,
I'm
one
breaking
thing.
my rule here. I'm reading chat.
That's all good. One thing that I have found refreshing. This isn't Dagnip in particular, but the perception of the United States and how that is very different depending on who you ask. There are certain people from countries in the U.S. or outside of the U.S. who see the U.S. as more or less a good actor. They're trying their best. They have their problems, but they're kind of a force for good in the world. And I've had some viewers from South America who really hate the U.S. And if you look at the history of what we've done in South America, it makes sense. There were some
Yeah.
pretty gnarly interventions there that were not favorable to the people of those countries at all. And it was like, how much can we influence and exploit this region for our benefit rather than for their benefit? So it's refreshing that every country has made mistakes, and if you look around, you'll be able to find out what those were, and it gives you a more sober perspective of your country, which is probably the cure for rabid nationalism, which is that we're just the best, and if we go and take any land, then that's an improvement because our way is better than their way, blah, blah, blah. People in the world are pretty diverse, and the model that you have in your country might work pretty well for you, but it's not necessarily how they want to live their lives.
Yeah, unfortunately, Latin America has a lot of that in its history, and the
Mm.
United States has played no small role in many cases. I think U.S. influence has generally been felt more in Central America than South America, just because economic influence, American economic influence in Central America is just so much greater in
Mm.
Central America. I mean, just in terms of investment, exports, imports, I mean, it's just there's just way more. But in South America, yeah, there was definitely a lot of skeevy shit going on, especially in the 1970s with stuff like Operation Condor and the military coups and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was back when Kissinger was still around. Did
Yeah.
you know Henry Kissinger, right?
Yeah. So there was a person who was a pretty big influence for me leaving religion, Christopher Hitchens.
Hmm.
And he was a contrarian in some ways. And there were some people who he just really despised as like some of the worst humans to ever crawl the earth. One of them was Bill Clinton. He wrote a book on him called No One Left to Lie To. And I believe Kissinger, he also believed to be one of the most evil people to ever exist. And part of it was Kissinger had this idea that the US should be moving around a lot of pieces on the board on the world stage so that we end up winning in the long term. And what that meant was there are a lot of countries super far from home that are self-determining more or less, and they're kind of waffling on that spectrum between, do we want to be more capitalist and more Western, kind of like the US, or do we want to take a more Eastern model? And it seemed like for Kissinger, correct me if I'm wrong, he believed that we should be moving these pieces and trying to tip things in our favor wherever we could do so, and in kind of a subtle way. So not necessarily just full on invading these countries, but propping up leaders who are more favorable to that sort of worldview.
No, yeah, that was his thing. He fancied himself a realist. And so his approach to international relations was very much one of realpolitik.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't think in terms of like the human cost. He thought in terms of the broader strategic picture. And whatever cost had to be incurred in order to maximize the United States position was a just and necessary cost to be incurred in pursuit of America's national interest.
Yeah, he's an ends justify the means kind of guy.
Yeah, exactly. I remember one of the famous Kissinger quotes from the 70s was when he was talking. I think it was when he was talking with Nixon at one point, because Nixon recorded like all of his conversations and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And they were talking about Chile, and Kissinger made the remark that the people of Chile could not be trusted to handle a matter so important as their international alignment. I'm paraphrasing, but basically that was the gist of it. He just that this is back when Allende was in power, and there was all this unrest about a lot of his left-wing reforms and stuff, and when the U.S. was trying to kind of maneuver him out of office, basically. And the result of that, of course, was the coup and Pinochet and all of that came after. But
That's so pretentious. They don't deserve to self-determine and choose their own alliances.
yeah. For him, they're just a piece on the chessboard, and the pieces don't get to decide where they go. You know, I mean, to be fair to Kissinger here, he was probably thinking in terms of like the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? We don't want to have the Soviets in our backyard, so we'll do whatever is necessary to ensure that doesn't happen again. So that
Mm-hmm.
was his focus, but that just illustrates the lack of consideration for autonomy, sovereignty, human rights. Obviously, I mean, the Nixon administration was not the Carter administration, to put it mildly. The
Yeah.
Carter administration went out of their way to try to make human rights a big part of U.S. foreign policy. It was kind of hit or miss as to how successful they were, but they did try. But Nixon was just the opposite. Their whole thing is that, if we have to support a military coup that's violent and suppresses people, hey, so be it. Whatever is necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Chile had it bad because of Pinochet, and then there was a military coup in Argentina, which I'm actually going to ask Dagnip about in my next email. Very curious about that. Because I know that the military was very anti-communist, but I had thought that the Peronists were also anti-communist. And it was the Peronists that the military overthrew. So I was a little confused by that. I'd read that the Peronists kind of had their own internal dynamic where there was like a pro left-wing labor faction and then also a right-wing nationalist faction.
Mm-hmm.
And that they kind of had like this uneasy alliance, but sometimes clashed with each other. So that's something I don't fully understand, and hopefully I can get into that with Dagnip later on. Maybe have something interesting to talk about on stream later. But yeah, the Peronists were not exactly soft on communism. They themselves were sicking the military on them in the early 70s. And then later on during the coup, of course, the crackdown got way, way worse. So that's what they were dealing with. I think the dictator in Argentina was a general named Vidali, something to that effect. I want to say it started with a V. And then Brazil had their military coup in the 1960s. And that was actually kind of different. Brazil always has to be different in Latin America. They don't even technically consider themselves Latinos. I don't know how many people are familiar with that, but in Brazil, they think of themselves as kind of being a culture and country apart from Latin America. They themselves think of Latin America as the Spanish-speaking part of Central and South America, and they don't really see themselves as being like fully a part of it. So they kind of have their own thing going on in terms of their own headspace, in terms of how they think of themselves in relation to Spanish-speaking America. And so their military coup kind of reflected that. It wasn't a part of like the trend of anti-communist coups in the 1970s. Their coup had more to do with internal power struggles within the government. It was kind of democratic in Brazil in the 50s and 60s, kind of, sort of. but they never really allowed communists to compete, for obvious reasons. And what happened is that there was one general, or at least one guy who was aligned with the military, who was a little too soft on the communists, according to the military. He was kind of starting to free up the political space, was starting to liberalize the politics a little bit. And that's when the military said, okay, this is stupid. We're just going to get rid of you. And then they seized power.
Mm.
And that was also interesting because the result of it was actually a lot of nationalizations and a certain amount of distancing from the United States. In Brazil, it's generally assumed that the United States and the CIA were like at least partly responsible for the coup, that we had some involvement. But from what I was reading, the involvement was relatively minor. We basically just said, okay, we won't do anything if you launch the coup. But it wasn't necessarily like a CIA sponsored coup per se. I think it was, from what I was reading, it was more the military just trying to seize power because it didn't like the direction the country was going in. And they also, again, to reiterate, part of the evidence for this is that they actually distanced themselves from the United States diplomatically. They didn't really like the United being dependent on the United States. They wanted Brazil to be kind of its own power within the region, if not a world power eventually. And so they became more insular. They kind of mitigated access to international trade. They became more protectionist. They did a lot of things like that. And again, they did a lot of nationalizations, which of course the United States never really likes. That was kind of a bugbear for the United States in the 1950s and early 60s. But over the course of the 60s and 70s, U.S. foreign policy changed, and by the 60s and 70s, the U.S. didn't really care that much about nationalizations. If you wanted to do it, fine, just so long as you're anti-communist. It was pretty much okay with the CIA.
Mm.
So the Brazilian military did that. And the Brazilian military and Brazilian political culture had a lot of history in the 20th century with having a strong state. So it wasn't that unusual. It wasn't them being like socialist or communist per se. It was more about trying to modernize the country and build new industries so that Brazil could be as autarkic rather, as independent and self-sufficient as possible. So more of a nationalist agenda than a socialist one, but they ended up using a lot of left-wing style policies as a part of it. So Brazil, again, just a little bit different than the other coups, but they did have their own coup there. And then I think it was 1965 or so, if I'm not mistaken. Chat can correct me if I'm wrong on this, among other things. And Uruguay, though, also had a big coup in the 70s, and that they actually had one of the worst because they had like this really repressive regime that used a lot of like psychological torture. They used to take dissidents and put them in insane asylums and basically drive them insane. From what I was reading in grad school, Uruguay had as close to an Orwellian society as almost any government has ever achieved. And they weren't like Stalinist per se. It wasn't that kind of Orwellian. But if you've read 1984, a big part of the book is how the government uses psychological torture on people that it has in captivity. So that aspect of 1984 is more what the Uruguayan military was going after.
Mm.
Um, it's worth mentioning too that Uruguay, as usual, is the weird one here. Uruguay is almost always unusual in Latin American history. So in Uruguay's case, the military coup, so to speak, wasn't even really a coup. It was actually the two major political parties sort of in conjunction, asking the military to seize control and basically do whatever was necessary to suppress the urban guerrillas that were active in Uruguay at the time. There was a lot of like communist radicalist violence, especially in cities in Latin America, sort of in the 70s, especially early 70s. And that was sort of part of the genesis of the anti-communist radicalism that we saw by states that went on to commit acts of state terrorism that was nominally justified by fighting urban guerrillas of one sort or another. So the Uruguayan government didn't even wait for a coup. They're just like, hey, go do this thing. Just go commit state terrorism for a while, take a couple years, whatever you need, and then we can come back and have our democracy again later. Very strange stuff from what I was reading. But that's just Uruguay for you. So yeah, that was the kind of state violence that Latin America, well, South America specifically is what I'm focusing on here. That's the kind of state violence that they were facing in the 70s, and all of that involved the CIA to one degree or another, but especially the 70s violence in the Southern Cone region. The CIA was had a big role in that. Not necessarily in organizing it per se, but definitely in facilitating it. The CIA sent people to train them how to, quote unquote, interrogate people, which involved, torture and stuff, and also taught them counterinsurgency tactics. It taught them how to basically figure out who's, well, what you would call it now is networking. You would try to find the networks of insurgents and see how they related to each other and try to bring them in that way and unwind the networks with meticulous investigative work. Technical stuff like that. The CIA provided a lot of that. It could also be that CIA contractors were involved, but that stuff is like super secret and it's really difficult to figure out. I'm sure somebody more familiar with the topic might know more about it. There's probably been, revelations of some kind or another over the past couple decades, but it's not the topic that I'm more familiar with. But yeah, it was bad. There was a movie made actually about an American kid. Well, I call him a kid, but he was like, 18, 19, whatever. And he was in, I think it was Chile, if I'm not mistaken. And he was kind of a left-leaning guy, and he got involved with he got involved with the protests basically against the government. And when the coup happened, ended up getting rounded up along with a lot of the other activists, and he was actually murdered. And I think he was actually murdered in the stadium. For those of you who are not familiar, rather, with the coup in Chile, when Pinochet came to power, I don't remember the exact year. I want to say it was like 1970. A lot of the early dissidents that were rounded up and killed, like in the first week or so, a lot of them were brought to the stadium in the capital of Santiago, and they were processed, quote unquote, processed, there in the stadium. And this American guy was actually one of the people that were brought there and killed. And his father came down and tried to figure out what the hell happened to him and basically kind of pieced it together over time. And the story was sufficiently dramatic that a movie was made about it, which is how I know about it. It was one of the movies I saw from Latin America, well, about Latin America that I watched in college when I was trying to learn more about the region. And yeah, that was like a really dramatic thing to watch. The best scene in the movie. I don't want to spoil it, but I know that most of you probably won't watch it. It's kind of an old movie, but the best scene in the movie is when the father is meeting with the State Department rep in Santiago, and and they're talking about, what role the CIA had in the killing and, who was responsible for it. And, the State Department rep is kind of being cagey about it. And eventually he kind of just leans in and says, look, if the mafia were to kill somebody and disappear somebody, you would probably have a pretty hard time pinning it on somebody in that case, wouldn't you? And I'm paraphrasing, but the implication is, yeah, we were involved, but you're never going to be able to prove it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of the point in the movie when it like becomes abundantly clear that the US is like deeply involved, to varying degrees. It was a cool movie. Again, a little dated, and it definitely has like one particular perspective, but yeah, overall pretty decent representation. Yeah, the only criticism I would have is that it's kind of America centric. It was not an American event. It was a Chilean event, but Americans don't really watch many foreign movies. We don't import that many, so we tend to mostly focus on American stories that focus on how Americans tie into them. So
Mm-hmm.
better than nothing. If you do want something that's more relatable as an American, that's a good starting point. But I'm sure there must be some good Chilean movies about it too.
For
I don't
sure.
know of any. The only Chilean movie I know about that period was the one that was made about the referendum at the end of Pinochet's rule. Pinochet had a referendum about whether or not military rule would continue. And there was a lot of drama and competition trying to convince people to vote against Pinochet and to reinstate democracy. And yeah, really, from what I've read anyway, I still haven't seen it. I need to. It's on my list. But there was a really good movie made about the PR campaign leading up to the referendum and about how they had to kind of toe the line between respecting existing censorship laws while at the same time trying to make as strong a pitch as possible to remove the dictator. Interesting stuff.
Well, nice.
Sorry, that was a long ass tangent, but
We get a little quick tour of South America.
yeah,
Is
it's a fun topic. That's one I can jump into.
Yeah, nice. Well, big ups for powering through an episode plus with the 3 hours of sleep. I always feel icky gross if I have less than 5 hours.
Well, in my defense, well, maybe not defense, but I took like most of that 3 hours was a nap not long before we started. That was actually why I texted you like an
Ah, okay.
hour afterwards after you
Right, right.
texted me. I was still asleep.
Nice.
So I've got my energy reserves are small, but they're recent. So that's kind of carrying me through here.
Today's Agent Smith powered by a power nap.
Hey, don't knock them. They work.
Yep.
Ask anybody who's been in the army; they'll tell you those power naps will save your life.
True. Well, appreciate your input as always, sir. Good talking with you. And thank you, chat, for contributing to the conversation. Fuzzy Cord for handling questions. And we will see you all on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thanks for having me. See you next time.
GG. Nice.